I mean, just one of the best operators, smartest people ever. I've been blessed to know and work with him and his office for many years. Those are big shoes to fill. Yeah. John Thune has a different conference. You know, for the first time, the majority is actually under 55. So it's an interesting generational shift that's happening.
Yeah, amazing.
And people who have more of a populist view of America first, as opposed to, you know, that Wilsonian thought process that, you know, a generation ago had.
Well, so how does that change your job? When you're dealing with populists, that changes the rules for lobbying, does it not?
Well,
or does it make it more predictable?
Well, we're advocates for American employers, so I think it makes it far better for us.
Okay.
You know, I mean, bringing jobs to America and creating industry in America is what we do, and representing those interests is an honor. And you know, I think it's the mandate that the electorate said is like, look, you know, we don't want to pay $2 more for eggs or $3 more for milk. We would like to buy into the American dream. So how that gets processed is just a new venue.
But a populist streak makes things less predictable for you, does it not?
I think the math is the same.
Really?
Absolutely.
Talk to me then about the business of relationships. You've got new people coming into Washington. You've had a number of retirements here.
Yeah.
You never stop. You're the ultimate networker. How do you function when you're in a time of transition like this?
You know, you help your friends, you support your friends, you listen, you show up, and you know, a lot of the people that I am blessed to represent have employment in many districts, and we sit and listen and talk and continue the conversation. That's all it is.
Who's calling right now? Is it your existing clients? Is it new business coming in? What's it like in the weeks after the election?
I mean, you talk to your clients every day. I mean, you know who we represent, so we talk to them every day. And, you know, I've had meetings with new people who are looking at opportunities to advance their agenda and create more jobs in America. And
you can give our listeners and viewers a sense of who you represent, by the way, if you choose to name names.
Fantastic, top-tier corporations.
That's very well done. I had a feeling you might answer it that way. So talk to me about the year ahead. Will extending the Trump tax cuts and the provisions that come with it be the biggest job?
You have to do that. How do you not? I mean, a part of, listen, I know Build Back Better and all the things that we did, but what spurred economic growth were the fact that people have more money in their pocket. And honestly, you have to extend those tax cuts. But
that's got to go through K Street.
I think it has to go through the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee.
Hear that on Schoolhouse Rock. You know? But you know that's not going to pass without the help of guys like you.
I mean, I don't think it's going to pass without 218 people in the House and 51 in the Senate.
You're not taking credit for this. Talk to me about Christmas trees then. Because we're going to make
a big one. We're about to buy one right after Thanksgiving.
Okay.
And, you know, I prefer white lights on mine.
Well, you can put all the white lights you want on this thing. They're called amendments. They're called
riders.
Yes, absolutely.
So
how's that going to
you're
work?
talking about the funding bill. Look, the government.
Get into it. We run out of money on December 20.
We do. And I think it will be a short-term pass to allow for more review on government funding. And listen, I'm enthused about, you know, the president saying that he wants us to look at wasteful government spending. I mean, all due respect, I mean, you can cut 5% across the board right now and return it down and lower our debt yield. I mean, you just can do it.
You like this Elon Musk idea, the Doge?
The Doge with Vivek and Elon?
Yes, yeah.
I think it's a good idea.
Somebody's got to listen to them, though, and enact it.
I think
that's when another phone call comes to your office.
I think people need to realize, you know, when government agencies can't pass an audit or don't know where the money went 5-7 years in a row, maybe there's a problem. Maybe there can be cuts. I think President-elect Trump is absolutely right that, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse exists, and I think there are better ways to spend it.
We could see our first $1 trillion defense budget this year.
We could.
Do you see that happening, and to what extent will that money stay here in the U.S.? This is something that you're going to end up talking about a lot next year.
I mean, I think that we are realizing what the true threats facing our country is. And, China is an exigent threat. They are looking and our trade routes violating the Monroe Doctrine every day of the week. You have Russian trawlers that are cutting internet cables.
That's right.
And, this affects our communication. And I think we need to take a look at how our information flow, our financial tools, and how our commerce trade lines are looked at. And I am enthused about Secretary of State designate Marco Rubio and the team that's coming in there. And I think the economic team that President Trump will name will be well received by the market.
It's interesting that we're at Bloomberg, so we're obsessing over the Treasury Secretary.
I think you should
be. Well, it's going to be a pretty big deal. We're also obsessing over some of the names that have been floated that certain senators don't think they can support.
Yeah.
And to the extent you want to weigh in on the Matt Gaetzes, the Pete Hegseths, they're being walked around by J.D. Vance right now. You've seen this process before. Is it different this time or not?
No, it's the same process. Look, I was lucky enough to be one of the people who walked around one of the sub-cabinets under the first Trump administration. I will be doing that under this administration, incoming.
President-elect is not asking too much of the Senate to clear all these names?
I think the president-elect has the right to name whoever he wants, and the Senate has the right to advise and consent to that.
So you're not feeling a rubber stamp in the Thune conference when it comes to these?
I mean...
They may not all pass.
As I like to say, they all sing from the same hymnals, but they sing the words that they wish.
Okay. So not everyone gets confirmed. That's normal, right?
No, but, show me one administration that everyone has been confirmed ever. It just doesn't happen.
We have only about a minute with Rob Waters. What will be the biggest opportunity when it comes to the business of influence in Washington in 2025?
I would say drinking wine with you.
That's not an acceptable answer.
It isn't?
No, as much as I like the sound of it.
I think the economic vision that President Trump has is a good vision, and helping enact that will be one of the best opportunities for America.
Is this the year that Washington gets religion on tariffs?
I think Washington's going to get religion on a few things.
Yeah. The Madison Group. Don't be a stranger. You'll come back again?
If you have me.
Okay. Rob Waters, the Titan of K Street, we promised here in Washington, live on Balance of Power. Great to see you, and thank you for the insights, as always. Save me some wine. I'm Joe Matthew in the nation's capital on the fastest show in politics. We're going to put all of this together with our panel coming up next. Jeannie Shanzano and Maura Gillespie are with us from Capitol Hill to the transition and some important news on geopolitics today. We haven't gotten to Ukraine yet. We have a lot more to cover here on Balance of Power. In our second hour, when Kaylee Lyons joins us, we also have an important conversation with Congressman Mike Lawler. The Republican from New York will be with us straight ahead on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
1240 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with the developing story headline right now off the Bloomberg Professional Service. Unilever shelving its ice cream unit sale. That'd be Ben & Jerry's to focus on a spinoff. That according to the FT. So again, this headline right now from the Bloomberg Professional Service. Unilever freezing a sale of its ice cream unit. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now. Stocks lower with the S&P down 29, decline there of just about 0.4%. Dow Industrials slumping by 53, a decline there of 0.1%. NASDAQ down 111, a decline of 0.6%. 10-year at 4.39% with the 2-year at 4.29%. We've got gold up $19 the ounce, up 0.7%. 26.51 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude 69.06 a barrel, down 0.5%, while Bitcoin at a record, surging 2%, 94,107 right now on Bitcoin. Economic data, the Mortgage Bankers Association reports a key loan rate running at an almost half-year high. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Last week's 30-year mortgage rate reached 6.9%, the highest since 7% in July. The Federal Reserve has been trimming the benchmark U.S. interest rate amid signs inflation is moderating. But the bond market, which influences mortgage rates, sees inflation flaring up again if the second Trump administration imposes tariffs and other policies. Surveys indicate many Americans went to the polls with inflation on their minds. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Earnings news, Target missing the mark with the stock plunging 21%. The retailer trimmed its full-year earnings outlook. Also after earnings today, TJX, parent of Home Goods, among other chains. Right now we've got TJX, little change, down by less than 0.1%. The big event after the close of trading. Yes, we got you covered on Bloomberg Radio. NVIDIA shares down now by 1.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much, and thank you for being with us here on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. You got the broad view from Charlie Pellet on the markets, and we want to drill down for a moment, while we have a moment, on a couple of specific areas, because after 4 o'clock, the building is going to shake. Where Charlie is sitting right now, world headquarters in New York, will feel the tremors of NVIDIA's quarterly report. This is a big deal around here because it's a big deal on the market. Many argue NVIDIA is the market. And so we want to get into some of the action here that we might prepare for, because options are telling us we could see some pretty big moves in either direction, whether it's good or bad news. And Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle is with us from New York. A little bit lower ahead of this. We're a little nervous before this report. Abigail, what do you see?
It seems that investors are just a little bit anxious ahead of this big report. And the reason that they're anxious, a number of reasons. You were mentioning those options positioning for this chip maker, suggesting that there will be an 8% move up or down. That would equate to $300 billion up or a gain, or a $300 billion loss. Given the fact that it's the biggest point contributor to both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ, it is going to be a market-moving event in the after hours, then overnight in the futures market, and then certainly tomorrow. Now, relative to the quarter, folks are expecting 74 cents in adjusted earnings on just about $3.3 billion in revenues. It's a little bit shy of that, actually. The big question is, will it be enough? Because this stock, another reason that this is so important is the stock is up about 200% on the year. The AI craze driving this chip maker higher. The growth is good. It's above 80% year over year for both the top and the bottom line, but that's compared to 122% on the top line a year ago and 165%, or sequentially, I should say. So the growth is actually decelerating. At some point, analysts, investors are going to wake up to this, and you're going to have the music has stopped moment. We don't know if that's this report, but you're right. The building here may just shake at 420 today.
You know it will. It's NVIDIA. So I've got to ask you about what's happening in retail here. We had earnings from Target. Charlie mentioned this. Speaking of the building shake, my God, it's down over 20%. But it's not just Target. You look at Walmart blew the doors off with its report. It's near an all-time high. It looks like it's just barely positive right now, Abigail. And Williams-Sonoma is up more than Target is down. So is this a company-specific issue or are consumers pulling back? How do we read it?
It's hard to tell right now because there's so many mixed signals around the consumer in terms of stores and products that they're moving toward and stores and products that they are moving away from relative to Target, a massive miss, apparently price cutting not luring customers in. That Target feeling that people joke about, but when they are really on point with product, they do really pretty well. So there's some concern here around the holiday quarter, but you would say that Target is more the staples. There's some discretionary in there, but Williams-Sonoma, to your point, up 30%, the best day since 2008. They did beat earnings by 11%, sales by 1%, so good beats. But this is a high-end kitchen store, so the fact that people are shunning Target but going to a high-end kitchen store, it's a little bit baffling. TJ Maxx put up a good quarter. Walmart earlier this week, a good quarter. High-income shoppers going there for value. We're looking for more and more signals, but it is interesting to note that Dollar General and Dollar Tree, those bargain stores, they're both down more than 4% in sympathy with Target. So it seems to be some, the companies that have not been doing well this year. It's not even a division between the needs to have and the nice to haves, because of course Williams-Sonoma is a nice to have, the need to have at Target and Dollar General and Dollar Tree. So there may be, to your point, some company-specific issues at those stores, but we still need to see more signals on the overall health of the consumer.
All right, Abigail, great to compare notes, as always, with her eyes on some specific issues we're following today. We'll have results, of course, after the bell from NVIDIA, as you would expect, right here on Bloomberg. And we'll be talking with our own Michael Shepard about the geopolitical aspect of that report. This company has tentacles in so many areas, and when we consider the work of the administration now with the CHIPS Act here in Washington, but also the restrictions that have been put on NVIDIA technology in China, is something that we're going to be listening for updates on very closely. As we turn to the U.S. House of Representatives now, the balance of power, yes, I said it out loud, here in Washington, and just how thin the majority in the House specifically will be. We could be in a world where Mike Johnson has a smaller majority in the new Congress than he has right now. Maybe a majority of one. We're not quite there yet, by the way. There are still 5 uncalled races, if you can imagine that. Thank you, California. That will help to give us the final numbers here. But the fact is, if Democrats flip both California seats, Republicans will have just a 5-seat majority, 220 to 215. You say, well, Joe, that's more than one. But remember, Donald Trump is raiding the cookie jar for what? At least 3 cabinet members. A couple of people calling sick. We don't have a majority. And that's where we start with our political panel. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and political science professor at Iona University, and a veteran of the House of Representatives, Maura Gillespie, founder, principal, BlueStack Strategies, Republican strategist, veteran of John Boehner's Speaker's office. It's great to see you both here. And Maura, for that reason, I'll start with you. Is Mike Johnson's job actually going to be more difficult in the new Congress?
It certainly will be, given the numbers we're seeing, and just the fact that it looks like Trump world is picking people from his, Republican conference. And so you see some members, we're watching kind of it play out right now with a steering committee and bolstering up support there to make sure they have a strong leadership team around them and making sure that there isn't any defections going forward. But because there's going to need to be bipartisan work being done, that's the only way to get things done moving forward in such a thin majority for Congress and for the House especially. And so I think Mike Johnson made a joke about it maybe last week or so, saying enough, please stop taking my members to the Trump administration. What? But I think it was probably both in jest, but also in sincerity, because this is a problem for him. Again, some of these seats that we're waiting to hear about, while a lot of them are strongly Republican, pretty red districts, it still is concerning to have those gaps.
Maybe, Jeannie, you can go out to California, help him count the rest of the ballots here, because I do believe it's been more than 2 weeks now. We told people it could be as long as 2 weeks, and we actually still don't have them all yet. But I'm curious about lessons learned here, Jeannie, and what we might go through in the new Congress. Hakeem Jeffries is sitting back watching all of this. He's probably kind of smirking right now, thinking about Mike Johnson with a majority potentially of 1 seat. And he's been working in that environment for some time, ever since he actually took over from Nancy Pelosi. So what will be the role of the Democrats in that world, knowing that Mike Johnson will need them for most everything? And I'll be more specific by asking you about the Speaker's election. Will Democrats help to reelect Mike Johnson in a world where he's got 1 or 2 seats to spare?
You know, that is an open question. I think the Democrats are going to do what they did last time around. I think responsibly, they should try to keep us moving forward, but you can't promise that's going to happen. Johnson has the toughest job in Washington, D.C. I mean, if you compare it to 2017 when Trump came in, he had 241 Republicans. Now, to your point, he is facing potentially just 1 seat, and that is incredible. It means that any member on his side can take exception to what Mike Johnson wants to do and make his life really, really difficult. So we talked about the fact they changed the rules on ousting the speaker. That doesn't get codified until the new House comes in January. And there is every ability for a renegade Republican, just one, to hold that up and to make his life difficult. And that's just for him to become speaker. Once he does that, he's supposed to change the tax code. He's supposed to adjust the debt ceiling. He's supposed to fund the government. I mean, this is going to be an uphill battle for Mike Johnson. And there's more expectations because the Republicans own Washington, D.C. now. So he has the worst job there, I have to say.
Wow, that's saying something in this town. Maura, will Democrats help to elect Mike Johnson as Speaker again?
I doubt it. I think that the Republicans seem largely solid behind Mike Johnson, at least going into the Speaker's vote. I think that some of those outlier members hopefully have, I wouldn't say learned their lesson, but they realize that with Trump being president, they don't really benefit by lashing out against Mike Johnson because they're supposed to be presenting a unified front. They're supposed to be on the same team, and they're supposed to be doing the work. And by holding things up and being an antagonist just for the sake of being an antagonist doesn't really bode well. Maybe it gives them the little bit of fame they want, but that's not helpful in the long term, especially if they're looking to please Donald Trump. So I don't think that Democrats will need to save Mike Johnson, but I do think once he becomes Speaker, the relationship between Speaker Johnson and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries is going to be even more important.
Curious development coming out of the House now, considering the election of the first trans representative in the House of Representatives, openly trans, Jeannie. This is Representative Sarah McBride, who's just coming to Washington for orientation. Speaker Johnson now officially announcing that he will ban transgender women from using the women's restrooms and locker facilities in the United States House of Representatives. He told GOP members he was going to do this, and here we are. It's now official, and we see a statement from the Speaker's office. Is this sensible policy, Jeannie, or just bullying?
This is coming from Nancy Mace in particular, who introduced this ban, which many people believe was targeted, to your point, at Sarah McBride from Delaware. And this is something that Nancy Mace has come out just in the last several hours saying that she has been the target of death threats as a result. So it has gotten incredibly contentious, and the politics of transgender rights that we saw come front and center during the campaign has now made its way onto Capitol Hill. And, you know, the reality is Sarah McBride was duly elected by her state and by her district, and she has every right to use the restroom of her choice. And this does seem to be bullying on the part of Nancy Mace and the Republicans. It is no way to conduct the business of the House of Representatives to start off the new Congress, the 119th, with a focus and aim at one member that you want to isolate.
What do you make of this, Maura? There are a lot of people who talked about the trans issue during the campaign and think there's a mandate to do something like this. But this is the people's house. Should the Speaker be targeting an individual in this way?
Well, one thing I'll say about the House, and especially this is only on the House side, the Senate side doesn't have the same rules, so that won't apply on the Senate side. What's interesting, though, is that for the longest time, up until recently, there wasn't even a women's bathroom available for members on the floor where votes were happening. They'd have to go downstairs in the Capitol building down to the visitors' bathroom and use that one, which is, again, I worked in the Capitol building. That's what we had to do, to go downstairs, and For members to have to do that. So it's taken, to talk about progress, it's taken a long time to even just get them the Lenny Boggs room, so women have a room to go to up on the second floor, which is, for those unfamiliar, it's in the rotunda of the Capitol building, just off the House floor. Saying that, we have a ways to go about progress. I think that there's a conversation that needs to be had. We haven't sorted out how to best deal with, talk about women and transgender in sports and things of that nature. So a lot still needs to be discussed, and we're not there yet to have that kind of a solution.
I'm just trying to figure out if the speaker wants her to use the men's room. Is that where we're at? We'll keep our eyes on this for you, and we'll welcome our global television audience for Hour 2 of Balance of Power. Do stay with us. Congressman Mike Lawler from New York will join, and you want to be there for this conversation right here only on Bloomberg.
Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The Republican leadership on Capitol Hill takes shape. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the GOP sets the hierarchy in Congress to advance the Trump agenda. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kayleigh, no matter who is in charge, they're going to be leading a razor-thin majority.
Yeah, well, we don't have every vote counted in terms of the total tally for the balance of power in the House of Representatives. We do know it will be tight, and tighter still when you take out the 3 members of the House that have been pulled for the second Trump administration. One of them, of course, being Matt Gaetz, who is already retired and is no longer taking part in this Congress, let alone considering the next one. But it is Matt Gaetz who is the subject of much focus in Congress today, all the same as the House Ethics Committee is gathering at this hour to decide whether or not they want to release their report looking into him.
The worst kept secret in Washington. I think at this point we've heard from the lawyers of the women who were interviewed for this report, and there will likely be an FBI check tied to Matt Gaetz's confirmation. There are some questions about that we'll explore ahead with Congressman Krishnamurthy, but indeed, this is going to be an important day as they decide whether to make this public, at least on a formal level, Kayleigh.
Yeah, and we're going to go live to Capitol Hill in just a moment. As Joe alluded to, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of Illinois, the Democrat, will be joining us just ahead, right after we get a check on these financial markets. Charlie Pellet has a look from New York.
Thank you very much indeed. Investors certainly keeping an eye on geopolitical developments. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ in the red right now, right to the numbers, with the S&P at 58.85, down 31 points now, down 0.5%. Dow Industrials down 69, a decline of 0.2%, while NASDAQ is down 135, a decline of 0.7%. 10-year at 4.38%, with the 2-year right now at 4.28%. Spot gold up $19 the ounce, up 0.8%, 26.55. Right now we have got Bitcoin up 1.9% at 94,059. We are seeing Bitcoin at another record today, while West Texas Intermediate crude 69.10 a barrel, WTI down by 0.4%. NVIDIA Wednesday ahead of earnings. We got NVIDIA down 1.3%, complete coverage as that story breaks after the close of trading on Bloomberg Television and Radio. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, and Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. I'm Kayleigh Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we really all have many questions today, but one of them particular looming large over Capitol Hill, and that is the question of whether or not we will see in full by sanctioned release the Ethics Committee report into Matt Gaetz. Because remember, if the committee does not vote to actually release this formally, we could still hypothetically see it leaked.
Well, that's a good point. There's a big difference between the two. There are different ways to get this information, including, by the way, the lawyer of the women involved in this case, those who brought allegations against Matt Gaetz, has started doing interviews in mainstream media, and we're going to be surrounded by these stories one way or the other. But it's happening as we speak. As Kayleigh mentioned, the Ethics Committee is gathering right now, and our reporter at the location lets us know that Chairman Michael Guest has arrived. He had little to say as he did arrive, and the top Democrat, Susan Wild, is there as well. So this is happening as we speak, and we're joined now by a member of Congress, Raja Krishnamurthy, the Democrat from Illinois, is with us. Of course, ranking member, the Democratic leader on the China Select Committee. Congressman, welcome. It's great to have you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I wonder your thoughts on this, if you have any updates for us on whether this report will be released or whether you think it should be released.
I don't know what they're going to decide. I think it should be released. I think that there's precedent for this. We know of situations where there were severe scandals, and this is one of them where, we're basically having someone being nominated to be the top law enforcement official in the country, to enforce the laws, who's implicated in breaking so many of them. And I don't need to go through the sordid list, but this is someone who should not have been nominated, let alone confirmed.
Well, and as we consider the information that senators will have access to as they decide whether or not to confirm Mr. Gaetz, Bloomberg is reporting today, citing sources familiar, that the Trump transition team still has not signed an agreement with the Justice Department and therefore the FBI that would allow the Bureau to vet nominees. You, of course, also sit on the Intelligence Committee, Congressman, and I just wonder your thoughts on what it would mean if we don't get full background checks for, frankly, any of these people who could be getting some of the most powerful seats in the American political universe.
I think that's all you need to know with regard to some of these nominees. The fact that they're not willing to have a background check of these folks tells you that there are some serious flaws with them, not to mention that they're just ill-qualified and ill-prepared to do these jobs. And so I'm hopeful that the Senate will have hearings and vote a lot of these down. But I'm even more hopeful that maybe a couple of these will be withdrawn by the incoming president, given how seriously flawed they are.
Well, Congressman, no matter what happens here, it sure looks like Republicans and Democrats are going to have to continue working together if anything of any seriousness is going to come out of this Congress. Before you joined us, we were talking about the possibility of a Republican majority of one seat, realizing that's not the most likely scenario. It's still possible with now, I believe, 4 races to be called. We just had one called while we were talking, while you were answering that last question. Marcy Kaptur winning re-election in Ohio's 9th Congressional District. That is the longest serving woman in congressional history. And so the walls are closing in a little bit more here on this Republican majority. What role will the Democratic minority play in the new Congress? And will you help re-elect Mike Johnson as Speaker?
Well, I think that, let me answer the first part, which is I think the Democratic minority is going to be essential in getting the business of the chamber done. As you know, on spending bill after spending bill in terms of making sure the government functions, Mike Johnson and Kevin McCarthy, for that matter, relied on Democrats to supply the votes to get the bills passed. I'm not going to be supporting Mike Johnson. I'm going to be supporting Hakeem Jeffries to be Speaker, and I think we'll be unified in that particular vote.
Well, when we consider the idea that come the next Congress, whenever the new speaker is elected, there could be 3 vacancies that need to be filled by special elections, and that could provide a bit of leverage for Democrats. Congressman, how easy will it be for the minority to hold up the first 100 days agenda working with this kind of margin?
Well, there are any number of issues that require a majority vote. And as you know, some of my colleagues on the other side will not in any case, for instance, vote on spending bills, vote for them, I should say. I call them part of the vote no, hope yes caucus, where they are hoping that there are enough Republicans and, for that matter, the majority of Democrats supporting that measure to make it go through passage so that they don't have to support it and they can rail against it and rhetorically oppose it. So I think Democrats will absolutely be necessary for a lot of routine business that the incoming president as well as Speaker Johnson need to get done in Congress.
We're hearing about red lines, Congressman, from President Xi. This is something that we talked to you about, of course, because of your perch on the China Select Committee. And President Xi met with Joe Biden at the APEC summit the end of last week and reiterated his 4 red lines for when Washington turns over to a new Congress and, of course, a new administration with Donald Trump in the White House in January. Should he be concerned about what is coming? What will the Trump second administration mean for our relationship with China beyond this idea of across-the-board tariffs? Will there be a relationship between these two at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think there will be some continuity with regard to the policies of the Biden administration going into the second Trump administration, just the same way there was from the first Trump administration into the Biden administration. So, for instance, I'm hopeful that they'll keep the export controls in place with regard to high-end semiconductor exports. I'm hopeful that they'll keep the outbound investment restrictions in place. And finally, among other things, we have to do everything we can to repair our military industrial base and also equip Taiwan and our friends and partners and allies with what they need to deter aggression by the Chinese Communist Party.
What about TikTok, Congressman? Because apparently the president-elect wouldn't like to see it banned. After all, what's its fate in the United States given the legislation that has already passed and become law?
You're exactly right. It is the law. It's in the courts. I fully expect that it will be upheld by the courts. And if the incoming president wants to repeal that legislation, he should come back to Congress. Now, you should know that 360 people voted in favor of this legislation in the House, not to mention a huge majority in the Senate. And so I think that there's a lot of sentiment in favor of making sure that we protect our national security.
You know, Donald Trump has indicated that Mark Zuckerberg might be a greater threat to the American people than anything posed by TikTok. He says you get rid of TikTok and you empower Mark Zuckerberg. How would you react to that?
I don't think, I personally think that with regard to anybody in the United States, if the president wants to do something about social media, for instance, which a lot of us believe need to be regulated better, then we need to pursue legislation here in the House and the Senate and get it signed into law by the president, and we can do that. But with regard to a foreign adversary controlling a social media app, they are beyond our laws. They are beyond our rules and regulations. And that's why this particular law, which requires divestment by ByteDance of TikTok, makes sense, and that's why it commanded so much support.
Congressman, we were all a bit puzzled yesterday when the announcement dropped from the president-elect nominating Howard Lutnick to be Commerce Secretary. Also included in that announcement, saying that he is now going to have direct oversight of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which typically reports directly to the president. And I wonder, as we consider the relationship with China specifically, knowing the battle that is likely to come over tariffs, what you make of that move and this kind of operational structure?
I'm not sure. You know, all I can say is that the substance of the policies that they're talking about, across the board tariffs of 20% on all goods from everywhere in the world, would be severely disruptive, be super inflationary for my constituents. It would hurt my exporters in Illinois, including our farmers in Illinois. And then it would, you know, basically divide us from our friends, partners, and allies whom we need in countering aggression from China.
All right, Congressman, we always appreciate you joining us live from Capitol Hill and in your district as well when you are there. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, the Democrat from Illinois, live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. Of course, we all aren't really sure what this new structure is going to look like with Lutnick helming commerce and the relationship with the USTR, but we don't know who the U.S. Trade Representative will be either. That is one piece of this economic puzzle that has yet to reveal itself.
Yeah, we talked to Rob Waters about that a little bit earlier. He used to consult both the Commerce Department and the USTR, not sure exactly how they agree and what that will mean for the strength of the U.S. Trade Representative going forward. A lot of questions here, including who will be Treasury Secretary. We still don't know.
Still the big question remains unanswered, but Bloomberg's Saleha Mosin, senior Washington correspondent and host of the Big Take DC podcast, has been chasing that question relentlessly for the last several weeks. She's joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Saleha, we know Lutnick is not going to be Treasury Secretary. He will be Commerce instead, assuming he is confirmed. And so that whittles down the short list even more. And there's going to be some pretty important interviews happening in Florida today. Just walk us through what that means for the process and if it actually signals it's coming closer to an end.
Right. Lutnick being nominated to Commerce, it narrowed the list that expanded just before that was announced. So today we know, we've reported that President-elect Donald Trump will be speaking to Mark Rowan of Apollo, and he'll be speaking to Kevin Warsh, the former Federal Reserve Chair. He has already interviewed and had many discussions with Scott Bessent, a hedge fund manager, about the Treasury post and the NEC job. We've been reporting for a while that whoever Trump selects is most likely going to have someone of Wall Street pedigree, like all the men that he's been considering. And anyone being considered for Treasury Secretary could also slot into the very powerful role of National Economic Council Director at the White House.
Some have suggested that might have actually more emphasis in a Trump administration because you're actually in the White House with him, talking to him potentially on a daily basis. But I'm wondering about the idea of Senator Bill Hagerty. We're watching this SpaceX launch last night, and Kayleigh said, look who's standing behind Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Is he going to end up being the dark horse candidate for Treasury?
I think now it's no more dark horses. We know all their names. Haggerty's name has been in the mix for a couple.
Sleeper is a better word.
I like that, Joe. That's perfect. Sleeper candidate. His name has been in the mix for a couple of candidate secretary positions. Yeah. We heard about his name a lot for Secretary of State, and then it popped up for Treasury. I will just say he's definitely been in the mix. He does not quite have the sheer wealth that tends to impress Donald Trump. Rowan, Scott Bessent, Warsh, they all are very, very wealthy men. And that speaks volumes to someone like Donald Trump.
Well, we do know that he values that. He also places high value on looking the part, but there are policy objectives he would like to achieve here. And with Kevin Warsh specifically, I have a lot of questions about how much they really align. I've seen many people in the crypto community saying that he actually wouldn't be good for crypto because he supports CBDCs, for example. There's been some pushback in that regard. Then there's people who are pro-tariff who say he might not like everything Donald Trump would like to pursue in that arena. How much really do they align, or how much could they diverge, and could that be a deal breaker?
I think, Kaylee, what you're honing in on is the reason we're seeing this protracted battle over this job, because there's dueling forces over what Donald Trump wants and needs in this role. He wants a markets-minded person, but most markets-minded people are not super pro-tariff. Now, what we've seen play out with this battle is that it is showing how serious Donald Trump is about using tariffs as a tool of trade policy, maybe foreign policy and national security. So because of that, we've heard more comments from Scott Bessent about how aggressively the U.S. can and should pursue using tariffs as a tool for some of these policies. Kevin Warsh, it's a little bit of it's confusing, right? What he's spoken about globalization and being against protectionism, those are 10, 15-year-old comments. I want to know, what would he say today? Because you base your answer on what's the current economic landscape is. We could say the same for Rowan. We don't know these kinds of where he falls on that too.
All the while, there's an ethics committee meeting getting underway right now, the House Ethics Committee, on whether to release this report into Matt Gaetz. Whether they do or not, senators who are preparing to deal with his confirmation are now requesting the FBI file on Matt Gaetz, which is going to be, I presume, the next fight here. Capitol Hill seems to be evolving a little bit. We're hearing a few more people express concern about specifically this pick, if not Pete Hegseth already. Is Mar-a-Lago evolving, or does Donald Trump still say, clear all my nominees, I have a mandate?
Yeah, I love talking about ethics in Washington.
Yeah.
But, Donald Trump's public comments show that he is standing by his choice for Matt Gaetz as Attorney General.
It's as simple as that.
Well, and perhaps more evidence of that, Matt Gaetz is currently being paraded around Capitol Hill by current Senator and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance for meetings. I guess it's just a question of to what extent there's progress in
Well,
those
to be in some of those meetings.
Yeah, to be a fly on the wall.
There are some senators who had very different feelings about Matt Gaetz, who said that he shared salacious videos with them in the cloakroom and so forth. These are the kind of conversations that are being had, which is taking a lot of the attention away from some of the other picks that we're obsessed with here on Bloomberg, like commerce, like Treasury. You giving Treasury till next week? What's your gut check?
I'm really hoping, just for my own personal sanity, that it's this week.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're all on board with
today's interview day.
Really nice.
Today's interview day.
All right, perfect. Saleha, thank you so much. Saleha Mohsen with us, reporting for Bloomberg. On the transition, with our political panel ahead next, Kaylee, we're balancing both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue today, which we haven't mentioned, by the way, not once yet. Joe Biden.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
82 years old.
82 years old. A lot has changed since his last birthday.
Yes, of course, he's celebrating that birthday, having just returned from the G20 in Brazil, one of his last big foreign trips as president of the United States. And on that note, we do have more coverage in geopolitics to discuss with what's happening in Ukraine and the ongoing war in Russia. So stick with us on Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all trading lower, with the S&P down now by 33 points, down by about 0.6%. Investors are digesting the latest Ukraine-Russia tensions. The Dow down 89, down 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 151 now. That's a drop of 0.8%. The Russell 2000 Index lower now by 0.5%. 10-year at 4.41%, with a 2-year that's currently yielding 4.30%. Gold up 0.6%, 26.47 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, 69.05 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin now up 1.6%, 93,815, was trading at a record above 94,000. After earnings, we've got shares of Target now plunging by 21% after earnings. TJX, parent of Home Goods, up by 0.1%. After the close of trading today, we will be hearing from NVIDIA. Ahead of earnings, NVIDIA shares down by 1.7%. FTX co-founder Gary Wang has been sentenced to time served due to his early cooperation in the fraud case that helped convict Sam Bankman-Fried. Recapping, S&P down 34 now, down by 0.6%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, where Joe and I are, the House Ethics Committee is gathered now at an undisclosed location as they weigh whether or not to release their report looking into now former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who, of course, resigned just days ago after Donald Trump nominated him to be Attorney General. Matt Gaetz, as we speak, is on Capitol Hill as well with the Vice President-elect J.D. Vance for meetings with a handful of Republican senators, knowing it will take many Republican votes, more than 50 of them, to get Gaetz confirmed. But senators, as well as members of the House, are looking for more information on Gaetz to be revealed, as we've heard from Congressman Sean Casten, who joined this program yesterday, as well as a number of Republican voices on the Hill yesterday.
The Ethics Committee has the authority to release that report, and I think what scares a lot of us is that we saw the last time that Trump was in the White House that he not only surrounds himself with sexual predators, people who are credibly accused of sexual assault, but suppresses that information.
I think I'm safe in saying that President Trump would like to see him have his confirmation hearing and get a shot. His chance to respond will be a confirmation hearing.
I think that if they want a speedy consideration of this nomination, we got to have as much transparency as we can.
We're creating a false crisis because the reality is all that information is going to be on display at the hearing. Think Brett Kavanaugh. I'm going to hold my folks to the same standard I would hold Democrat nominees.
A false crisis. Quite a few voices we've heard from on both sides of Capitol Hill in the past couple of days here as we assemble our political panel. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and political science professor at Iona University. Alongside Maura Gillespie, founder, BlueStack Strategies, Republican strategist. Maura, I'll start with you as our Republican. Having worked for John Boehner in the Speaker's office, you appreciate the traditions and conventions of the House of Representatives. Should the Ethics Committee release this report?
I think they should. It's not unprecedented. After Mark Foley left, they also released the ethics investigation into him. So I think there's precedent to do so. And again, if we're talking about a position for the cabinet level of, this is Department of Justice, Attorney General, this is huge. And the Senate needs to have the materials and everything possible to properly vet. And this report is important to that aspect. I think regardless, I believe Tom Tillis and a couple others, Senator Kramer, people have said, regardless of whether the committee decides to release it, it probably will get out. But I think that for the integrity of the institution, it should go through the proper channels, and I would like to see the Ethics Committee release that report.
Well, weigh in on this integrity question, Jeannie, because, of course, the House Ethics Committee is unique in that it's equal representation from both parties here. It does require a certain amount of bipartisan cooperation because of that. And I wonder if the committee does not, in fact, rule to release this, but it gets out anyway, if that is going to create problems for investigations that could come in the future, where you would hope bipartisanship would be still the name of the game.
Yeah, I mean, that's in fact the concern, and the Democrats have that, Republicans have that. It does threaten the integrity of the committee. As Maura mentioned, it has happened in the past that they have released. One of my favorite sort of ideas that we've heard in the last 24 hours is somebody takes a page from the Pentagon Papers, goes onto the House floor and reads the report into the record so they wouldn't face any legal repercussions or the challenge of leaking to reporters. That would certainly make for a fascinating look at the congressional record after that. But I don't know if anybody will do that. You also have somebody like Wild on that committee, the ranking member, who has nothing to lose since she lost re-election. But it all does raise challenges about how the committee operates going forward.
Well, Donald Trump prefers to not use the FBI, at least this time around, to vet his nominees. And there is now a standoff with senators demanding that they see those who will be involved in the confirmation process, Maura, that they see the FBI file on Matt Gaetz. Is that not fair game for someone who could be running the Department of Justice?
It's absolutely fair game. You want to be the person who's running the entire department. You need to go through every proper channel that we have. And this is where it gets frustrating. And I think that for a lot of people who have worked on Capitol Hill or have encountered the former congressman, I believe he's now a former congressman, having resigned, it's not surprising, unfortunately, about these reports. And so for those who are pretending as if this is shocking news, they're just being misleading, because the stories about Matt Gaetz and what he has showed other members and other members have shared with us in the past does amount to a concern, and that's putting it lightly, about him having this position. And to think that he would just skate through or go through a racist appointment is really concerning, and it doesn't bode well to kick off your administration to go back into the White House and have this hanging overhead. I just don't think it's a smart move.
Well, we're getting some more moves or reports from the Trump transition. CBS News is now reporting that Trump is expected to name for the Office of Management and Budget, Ross Vought, who of course served in that role during his first term. He also is one of the authors, Jeannie, of a section of Project 2025, and this is not the first time we have seen a name put out that didn't have affiliation with Project 2025. And I wonder what this is revealing to you about just how closely we should expect that blueprint to be followed in this incoming White House.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point, because we've seen a number of these nominees so far, some of whom authored parts of the report, and there were hundreds of people on that report. So it's to be expected. But, I think it is going to impact the policy making going forward and is guiding what the Trump administration, incoming administration, hopes to do. And I think what's most concerning about that is we are often told that Donald Trump is authentic. He's not afraid to say the quiet part out loud. And yet he stood during the campaign and said he has nothing to do with Project 2025. It'll have no impact on how he governs. And yet these nominees tell a different story. So I think he does owe it to the American people to say, what is the affiliation there? How much of that is going to guide? Especially considering we got a nominee yesterday of Linda McMahon for education. Mm-hmm. And a big part of that report is focused on dismantling the education department.
Well, I want to ask you about that as an educator. You pointed me right to it. Donald Trump, in his statement announcing Linda McMahon, says, quote, "We will send education back to the states," all caps, and Linda will spearhead that effort. Her job essentially is to dismantle the Department of Education, but she's going to need congressional approval, or he will, to make that happen. In the meantime, it seems there's some low-hanging fruit, according to the initial analysis here, Jeannie, stopping schools from promoting inaccurate and unpatriotic concepts about American history surrounding institutionalized racism. That sounds like critical race theory. Also expanding voucher programs that direct more public funds to parents to spend on homeschooling, on religious schools. Do you see all that happening in the first 100 days?
Yeah, I don't see the dismantling for the reason you mentioned. They would need to overcome the filibuster, be very hard to do. And I do see her pushing for school choice. She will follow in the tradition of Betsy DeVos, who was devoted to that as well. The Senate is thinking on the GOP side of a tax credit in that direction. So I think she may see some movement there. But the issue of this CRT, or the critical race theory elimination, the cultural changes they're talking about, raises a really important question. What if the state of Massachusetts decides it wants to teach CRT? Are they going to use the department that they're talking about closing then to force the state not to teach it? I think they've got to make a choice. Are they for returning education to the state level, the local level? Or is it only returning it to the state and local level when the state is doing what this Christian nationalist movement envisions should be taught? And that's going to be a big fight about federalism going forward.
Well, so Maura, weigh in here. What do you think is more likely, that they just try to change what actually is mandated by the department and apply it nationally, or really do attempt to dismantle it and hope that they can get Congress to go along?
Well, to Jeannie's point, if they're going to go through making it, or returning it to the states, that would be somewhat consistent with what a conservative principle would be, smaller government. But to then enforce their will of what they want the states to do, that then is a contradiction and would be entirely hypocritical to then have that stance as well. So you can't have it both ways, pick one or the other. But I think also this idea that they're going to be able to do this in the first 100 days, really they have the 2 years, if you think about it, because there will be a referendum in 2 years, essentially, if people are liking the way that the things are going with the Trump administration or not, when we have another round of House votes and they'll get to weigh in. So it's really a matter of 2 years, essentially, to push through as much as they can or would like to get done.
It's time to start running for the midterms now, Maura. Would eliminating the Department of Education, Maura, be good for America?
I can't say that I think just full out dismantling it, but I do think, and this is something that you're starting to see people realize, there needs to be some accountability across the departments of, an audit. A lot of funds have been used in ways that we don't even know about. So having a little more transparency and a look into what each department is spending money on, I don't think is a bad thing. And I think it's something that we, as the American people who are funding a lot of this stuff through taxpayer dollars, should know what's being spent. So I think doing a deep dive on these departments is a positive step, and it's something that we should be okay with as a country that is severely in debt.
All right, Maura Gillespie and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're getting more reporting now out from our team here at Bloomberg about what exactly the second White House could look like and who could be in it, what kind of roles they could be filling. Apparently, the president-elect and his team are mulling creating the first ever White House crypto role and are vetting people for that post. Keeping in mind, of course, that over the course of the campaign, Donald Trump did say he wants to make the U.S. the Bitcoin capital of the world.
National stockpile or reserve.
Yes.
Just curious if this is a cabinet position. Does this fall under the Treasury Secretary yet to be named?
Is it a czar?
We'll have a lot to learn. Bitcoin, by the way, grayscale up 1.5%. This is Bloomberg.
140 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all trading lower. We have the S&P right now at 5880. It is down 37 points, a decline there of 0.6%. NASDAQ lower by 163 points. NASDAQ, the composite index, down 0.9%. Dow Jones Industrial Average now down 108, down by 0.3%. 10-year at 4.41%. The 2-year 4.30%. Spot gold up 0.6%, 26.47 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude 69.15 a barrel, and a record for Bitcoin today was trading above 94,000. Right now at 93,650. Bitcoin up by 1.5%. Bottom line here: stocks trading lower as investors digest the latest Ukraine-Russia tensions. We're also awaiting Nvidia after the bell. Nvidia shares ahead of earnings, down now by 1.7%. And yes, complete coverage. We've got you covered on both Bloomberg Television and radio. Ford is eliminating another 4,000 positions in Europe, further retrenching in a region where the transition to electric vehicles is losing traction industry-wide. Right now, we've got shares of Ford down 5.5%, Tesla down by 1.6%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much as we bring you politics from Washington. Charlie covering the markets in New York, and we want to stay there for a moment because the anxiety is building, Kaylee, as we get closer to NVIDIA earnings after the close. Stock is a bit lower than it was when we checked in with Abigail Doolittle about an hour ago, but we're going to feel the building shake after 4 p.m. when the stock that drives the market reports results.
Yeah, keeping in mind, this thing is giant. It has a market cap of well over $3 trillion. And if options are to be believed, they're pricing in a swing either way of roughly 8% after results.
Yes.
That's $300 billion in market cap.
That's right.
Could be knocking around here and moving the broader market along with it. So we did want to check in again with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, senior markets correspondent for us. So Abigail, obviously this is a behemoth. It has the power to take the entirety of the equity market for the most part with it. What should we be bracing for here based off of what you're seeing?
Essentially that big move, that potential for a big move that you're talking about, Kaylee, with options talking about or suggesting that there could be an 8% move up or down. This is very standard to NVIDIA. Typically after the quarterly reports, the moves are to the upside or the downside. Over the last year and a half or so, more so to the upside, some double-digit moves the day after they report earnings, of course, because of this AI craze. So in terms of drilling down a little bit, the expectation is that they're are going to report 74 cents in adjusted earnings on almost $33.3 billion in revenues. That's impressive growth for both of those items, more than 80% year over year, but it is decelerating on a sequential basis. Growth for the top line last quarter was 122% on year over year, and for the bottom line, I believe it was 165%. So the pressure is really on this company to continue to beat and boost in a big way. The stock up about 200% on the year, even with today's almost 2% decline. If they do not put up perfection, the stock could get punished. And to your point, it's the biggest contributor to both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ. In fact, for the S&P 500, which is up about 25% on the year, it's about 25% of the S&P 500's 25% gain on the year. So it is really critical. The building may just shake here at 7:31 Lex at 4:20 this afternoon.
God knows it will. We might feel it down here in Washington. Some wild swings in retail today, Abigail. We saw Target down, 21% now on earnings. But Williams-Sonoma is up 28% on its earnings. We saw a nice report from Walmart earlier this week. I guess the question is, are higher-end consumers in better shape? Is that what this tells us, or does Target just have issues all on its own?
There's so many different conflicting signals out there. It's hard to say exactly what is going on with the consumer. To your point, Walmart put up a good quarter. They also boosted, and apparently higher income consumers are going there for value. Target, on the other hand, has a very attractive, competitive offering relative to Walmart. Maybe not quite as much value, but that Target feeling in the past would bring people in. So to your point, that could be a bit of an issue there. On the other hand, what's so wild, having Target its worst day since since 2022, down more than 20%. And as you mentioned, Williams-Sonoma up 28%, the best day since 2008. This is a high-end kitchen store. I mean, so this is not a matter of nice to have and need to have. A lot of times when economic times are tough, that's what you want to look at. But that's not the case here. So yes, I think that there is some suggestions that it has to do with problems with Target, and then we've had problems with Dollar Tree and Dollar General. But we still don't quite know where the consumer is. It's these post-pandemic trends. Some of that wildness is still shaking through, it seems.
Isn't that the truth? We're still trying to figure out inventories after COVID. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Bloomberg Markets correspondent, watching stocks for us as we get set for NVIDIA on the late edition of Balance of Power. We'll spend some time talking about what we heard on the call with Michael Shepard, who covers the intersection of technology, Washington regulation, and Wall Street. And we've got a lot of geopolitical news that we have barely touched this hour, Kaylee, with some important headlines coming out of Ukraine. Really interesting. Yesterday, we were talking about this, the first use of the ATACMS missiles that the U.S. provided to Ukraine being used offensively against Russia, which then responded with an update of its nuclear doctrine. High stakes. Enter the Storm Shadow missiles provided by the U.K., now also being used offensively against Russia as we approach supposedly the start of peace talk with Donald Trump in office.
Yeah, and we have to keep in mind here that change to the nuclear doctrine essentially said that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons if a country that does not have its own nuclear power uses the artillery or the weaponry of a country that does conventionally to attack them. So if we're considering the U.S. and the U.K. here and allies providing this material, it becomes a question of what kind of response we're likely to see from Moscow.
Yeah, absolutely. Which brings us to our conversation with Daniel Fried, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland. He's now a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. It's great to have you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Give us your thoughts on this scenario where we see some escalatory moves happening on both sides in advance of what could be a negotiating process only 2 months from now. Do you see that as being possible?
First, I would question your characterization of the U.S. moves being escalatory. Russia started the war. Ukraine is defending itself. There is no reason that Ukraine should be limited in its use of weapons to defend itself. It's justified under the UN Charter, and it fits the definition of just war. You know, there is no good reason on earth why Ukraine should be restricted in its use of weapons when it is facing an aggressor that wants to wipe it out of existence. It is true that the Russians did some saber rattling with their nuclear doctrine. They have done that before. But I noticed that today some pro-Kremlin Russian spokesmen were saying in Moscow that Russia need not escalate, that it can just wait for the Trump administration to back off and rescind the Biden administration decisions. So what I think is going on, to back up, is that the Biden administration in its last weeks in office is doing what it should have been doing all along, which is giving Ukraine the tools it needs to defend itself. That's a good thing, whether it's the use of the ATACMS missiles or it's the use of anti-personnel mines to help the Ukrainians defend their own territory. The Biden people are strengthening Ukraine at the very end in anticipation of a Trump push to enter into negotiations, if that's possible, and I question whether it is, with the Russians to try to end the war. The stronger Ukraine is, the better off we will be. And the stronger Ukraine is going into any such talks, direct or indirect, the better off the U.S. and the free world will be. I think that's what's going on.
Well, Ambassador, can you elaborate on why you question whether these talks could be fruitful, whether they will happen at all? When we hear this type of talk from the Kremlin that they're ready for this, what is it really that you think?
Well, the Trump people, including Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, have outlined what they have in mind, which is basically a ceasefire in place. Ukrainian neutrality, that is either a moratorium on Ukraine going into NATO or permanent neutrality, and importantly, some measures to help Ukraine defend whatever line is agreed on. Now, that framework might be workable if, but only if, the United States and Europe take Ukrainian security seriously. Otherwise, you're just letting Putin take one bite now and the rest at a time in the future of his own choosing. That would be a disaster. But the sketch of the Trump world proposal could be workable if we're serious about Ukrainian security. Now, you asked about the Kremlin views. They have, Kremlin-connected spokesmen have dismissed the Trump world feelers about this, saying basically that they demand Ukrainian surrender. They demand, as precondition for even talking, that Ukraine give up its own territory and that Russia somehow have control over Ukraine's government and limits over Ukraine's military. That's not a serious position. That's a position demanding Ukrainian surrender. So it's not clear that the Russians are serious about talks. If they were, would anybody trust Putin's word? After all, he signed a border treaty with Ukraine recognizing its international borders at the beginning of the century, and now he simply ignores it and invades Ukraine and is trying to take over the whole country. So I don't think the Trump people will meet a reasonable partner in Vladimir Putin or anybody in the Kremlin. But if they are serious about supporting Ukraine's security and willing to work to make sure that the Russians cannot, with impunity, attack Ukraine again, there may be some workable way for the Trump world plan to go forward. I don't know this is true, but as an old policy person, I'm not interested in complaining. I'm interested in trying to work the problem.
Daniel Fried, you were ambassador to Poland. And I wonder your thoughts on what Andrzej Duda thinks right now. Does he want to see these weapons, ATACMS or Shadow missiles, used offensively against Russia? Does it strengthen President Zelensky's hand?
Well, hold on. You said using the ATACMS missiles offensively. Ukraine is not trying to take over Russia. Ukraine is defending itself. Ukraine went
But it used them against
Russia's...
Russia across the border.
Well, Russia has been attacking Ukraine using missiles against Ukraine.
I understand, but this is a breakthrough, Ambassador. They're being used offensively against Russia. Is that something that Poland wants to see?
They are being used to help Ukraine defend itself against a Russian attack. Let's be clear about that. This war is Putin's responsibility. Now, with respect to the Polish position, they want to see Ukraine be able to defend itself. That is critical to them. Andrzej Duda has a prior good relationship with Donald Trump. I think he's going to use that to urge the Trump people to stand up to Russian aggression and help Ukraine. The Poles I speak to have been pretty strong in urging the United States give Ukraine the weapons it needs without restrictions as to their use. The only restrictions on Ukraine's use of American weapons should be the laws of war that bind all decent and civilized countries. Other than that, there shouldn't be any restrictions. And I think the Poles have taken a pretty strong line. They take their security seriously. They're certainly spending a lot on defense, and I would too in their place. And I think Andrzej Duda, the Polish president, and the Polish government is poised to play a very good role here.
All right, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. That's former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, who is now a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. And as we consider what's happening in this region, Joe, we should also point out that Donald Trump today named former Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker to be ambassador to NATO. Whitaker, someone who has never served in a foreign policy or national security role, doesn't have that kind of experience on his resume, but has been the one selected to lead potentially these conversations with our allies.
Yes, and there are going to be some tough conversations, as we know. A number of our allies in European capitals are concerned about Donald Trump's approach to NATO, having threatened to withdraw from the alliance in his first term. Interesting to hear the ambassador argue for Ukraine's justification to defend itself. That is not something that we are questioning here on the program, but it is worth exploring the use of these weapons as we approach the potential for peace talks, Kaylee, and that's something that we'll keep doing.
Indeed. And we'll have more on this and the other stories we're following today in the late edition of Balance of Power, keeping in mind we're still waiting to see what emerges from the House Ethics Committee in regard to that report into the Attorney General designate former Congressman Matt Gaetz. So we'll have more coming up at 5 p.m. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week is straight ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek aren't here right now. It's me, Matt Miller, with Nora Melinda. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here.
Are you excited for 420?
420. Are people still celebrating that?
No, that's when NVIDIA earnings come out.
Of course. See, my mind's in the wrong place.
So we're looking forward. No, I'm with you on that. But we are looking forward to NVIDIA earnings. Could be earth-shaking. Options pricing is telling us we could see an 8% gain or an 8% drop, depending on which way it goes. We're obviously going to talk about that, get you an outlook with Ian King. Also, there's a ton of Fed speak today.
So much.
So we have the expert.
We got to hear from him.
Mike McKee in studio with us to tell us what's going to happen with the Fed's next move. Are they still purely data dependent, or are they looking ahead to Trump 2.0? We are going to talk as well with Nate Thuft. It's Manu Life Investment Management. He's the CIO there. In terms of building defense into your portfolio. And I was actually looking at a chart, Nora, that shows investors aren't really hedging as much as they could or should be right now.
Interesting. Did you feel like that may have been a shift after the election? I mean, maybe people are thinking a bit differently now that we have a sense of certainty?
Absolutely. That could be. But, you know, markets have gone pretty much up all year. And typically that increases an appetite for hedges. So we'll ask him what's going on there. Yeah. Very much looking forward to getting into these discussions. Right now, I want to get over to Charlie Pellet and see what markets are doing right now. Charles?
Hi, thank you very much, Matthew. We have got stocks trading lower right now with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all declining. It is NVIDIA Wednesday. All about NVIDIA, as Matt says, 420. That's the time when NVIDIA drops. We'll have it for you live on Bloomberg Radio and Television. NVIDIA right now down 1.9% of that, ahead of that absolutely critical earnings report. S&P right now down 37, 58.79, a drop now of 0.6%. The Dow down 113, down by about 0.3%, while NASDAQ down 166, a decline there of 0.9%. Your 10-year 4.41%, your 2-year 4.30%. Gold up $17 the ounce, up by about 0.7%, 26.49 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7, 68.95 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin cannot ignore the move today, up another 1.5%. Was trading at a record above 93,722 right now on Bitcoin. Earnings news: Target shares they are plunging after this morning's report. Target down now by just about 20.3%. Again, recapping NVIDIA after the bell, down 1.9%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charles, thanks very much for that. Charlie Pellet with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt Miller here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio with Nora Melinda. We're going to get an update right now on what's going on with the Fed as we wait for, you know, the more important event, which is NVIDIA earnings at 420. Did you see that? A couple of banks, I think Bank of America and Barclays, both said that this NVIDIA release is going to be more important than a Fed meeting or an inflation report.
I believe it. I honestly feel like it's the Super Bowl of all Super Bowls at this point.
For sure, this year. Nonetheless, we still care about economics and Fed policy. For that, we go to Michael McKee, our international correspondent for both of those things. Mike, we've had a couple of Fed speakers today, I think 3 already, and we are still expecting one more. So it's a packed day of Fed speak. What are we hearing?
Nobody cares. I mean, is it true that if NVIDIA disappoints, the stock market comes to an end? And we all
it would all be
jobs?
over.
Right.
Yes. A bigger concern than a nuclear Russia.
It certainly seems that way. What we're hearing from Fed people, if anybody cares, is that they're on board singing from the Jay Powell hymnal of we don't need to do this really quickly. In other words, we have options for December. We can decide not to cut rates if data don't go in our favor, and there's still a lot of data between now and then. So it's pretty much what you'd expected. The most interesting thing, though, for people who like social media and fighting and stuff like that, was Michael Barr, the vice chair for supervision.
We like conflict.
He was conflict. We love conflict. He was asked the same question that Jay Powell was asked at his news conference, and he said basically, sorry, Donnie, I'm not going anywhere. He's not going to resign when Donald Trump takes over, and he's going to serve out his term as chair, vice chair rather, until July of 2026. At that point, a new chair could be appointed, but only if there's an opening on the Fed, and his Fed governorship goes till 2032. So who knows how all this plays out with Powell and Barr standing up to Donald Trump.
I mean, speaking of the data that we've been watching, where are people looking next? I mean, we have employment data, inflation data. It feels like it's always changing what we should be really focusing on. Where are your eyes right now?
Well, the next thing we get is Fed minutes coming up on Tuesday, a day earlier than usual, not on Wednesday because of the holiday next week. And we'll see what they were saying during the meeting about the next meeting. And people will be very interested in that. Then we get a data dump on Thanksgiving, lots of data because everything gets, day before Thanksgiving because everything gets moved up. But the PCE spending and inflation and wage numbers come out. And that's going to be really important because the Fed targets PCE inflation. Then you've got November jobs, another November, the November CPI, both coming out before the Fed meeting, which is December 18th. Mark it in your calendars if the NVIDIA doesn't end the world between now and then.
We certainly hope not.
Yeah, we hope not, but we'll definitely find out. And
if NVIDIA is good, what happens? Stock goes way up. We have the wage, the wealth effect come into play. People spend more money, the economy overheats, inflation goes back up again.
So there are a lot of scenarios.
Either way, we lose, right?
Well, I just think there are a lot of scenarios in which the Fed would have to think about not cutting as much. Or is there any scenario in which they think about actually raising rates?
No scenario like that right now. The only scenario you could come up with probably is that whatever Donald Trump does would end up being inflationary, and there are scenarios for that. And if that's the case, then the Fed would probably end up raising rates. But the things that he would do would take time to have an impact on prices, and so it's unlikely that anything would happen in the near future. You're looking at roughly the end of 2025 or into 2026 before you'd see that kind of impact, which then becomes interesting because 2026 is when Jay Powell's term ends.
Right. And then Kevin Warsh replaces him. Okay, Michael McKee, thanks very much for that. We're going to get over to our chips reporter right now to dive a little bit deeper into NVIDIA. Ian King is standing by in our San Francisco bureau, and Ian, this report is all we've been waiting for 2 sessions. It's pretty interesting because normally I'm used to waiting 1 session for earnings and getting all hyped up, but we were doing this yesterday as well. What are the numbers that we have to see from NVIDIA? What do they have to give us so that they don't disappoint the street?
I mean, that's a very important question and arguably a difficult one to answer because in theory you would just look at what the consensus estimate is for forward revenue, and it's 37 billion is where we are at the moment, and say, hey, you topped that and you're doing well and everybody's happy. But not only is that estimate in the middle of an absolutely enormous range, but some investors are talking about, so-called whisper numbers way in advance of 40 billion, and the high end of the estimate range is well into the 40s. So frankly, who knows? I mean, last quarter they had a brilliant report and gave a very strong forecast, but it wasn't even enough.
Hey, Ian, talk to us about what people are going to be watching when we think about the Blackwell chips. I mean, there have been concerns about them overheating, and it's really been an area that's been in focus. What is the street looking for from that sector?
Yeah, I mean, we won't get precise numbers. What we will get is a characterization because it's wrapped into the data center business. They've said it's coming. They've said it's on track. They've said don't worry. Of course, there have been problems. But of course, everybody is worried because there's so much money at stake here in terms of the money that's been invested into the company. So what they really have to do, I think, to calm everybody's fears and come out and say, look, we've had billions of revenue already for this product, and we're going to have a lot more billions in the coming quarter. That might help people be calm if the top line numbers are okay.
What is the, I was looking at an interesting chart earlier and thinking about PEs and valuations and whether or not they're frothy. At some points, the PE has gotten up to almost 70. But right now we're only around 36, and this is, looking at forward earnings estimates. So if they have good earnings, the valuation could sink pretty low. I mean, certainly too reasonable for a growth darling of the stock market. So I feel like there's a lot more chance for upside in this setup. Are you hearing anything about that?
Well, all I can do is give you perspective. This year it's on track to have net income on a GAAP basis that is higher than total revenue last year. And remember, last year, revenue more than doubled. So how many companies can do that? So the E side of that ratio is going up at an enormously quick rate. You list the semiconductor index, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index by PE ratios. NVIDIA is not the most expensive stock. It's the best performing, but it's not the most expensive on a PE ratio. So you could take any of those signs that it's kind of living up to the promise that and living up to the money that's being invested in it. But at a certain point, you know, that ratio becomes too much for some people.
So we have Bank of America saying that this could be bigger than a Federal Reserve meeting or even inflation data. And we do have the options market that's actually pricing in a move of either 8% in either direction here for NVIDIA. Can you talk about just how volatile this is expected to be?
Well, last time we had more than a 10% move, and then in the stock based upon earnings. So when you've got more than $3 trillion of market cap at play, that's a big influence on the market, and I think people are rightly concerned or paying attention to that because it will have a knock-on effect. I mean, it's just incredible where this company has come from in such a short period of time, and the way it's eclipsed its you know, its customers even, you know, and its rivals in terms of size and influence.
So NVIDIA is a name that we all know, but what are their top competitors? What is the competitive landscape like?
If you ask Jensen Huang, the CEO and founder of NVIDIA, which analysts always do every quarter, he really doesn't pay much attention to them. His focus is let's get to the next chip, let's get the next one out, let's move things forward. Probably the nearest one in terms of capabilities, in terms of the chips that are out there right now, is AMD. They're having an amazing year, but guess what? Their total sales are going to be $5 billion. $5 billion is a lot better than no billion, which it was the year before, but it's nothing compared to NVIDIA's data center business, which is going to be more than $100 billion in revenue this year alone, and that's just one division at this company.
Is there any concern, Ian, that they're pulling forward demand? I mean, as everyone gets set up, you know, there's a huge one-time entry fee, and I'm assuming then later on there's going to be maintenance costs. Is this all still the one-time entry fee?
If you're asking, are we in a bubble? Has everybody basically bought all they need to buy? That's an ongoing debate. If we looked at what was said during earnings by their biggest customers, by AWS, by Microsoft, they're still spending. They still believe that we don't have enough capacity for AI computing in the world and that we're going to continue to spend heavily on that. So that was actually quite a good, fundamentally positive sign. Jensen Huang talks about $1 trillion of data center equipment in the world that needs to be replaced, primarily with his gear. If those two things are true, then not yet, right? We've not paid it forward. We're still in this growth phase. But of course, we're going to have to see people actually using AI and getting an economic benefit from it, or else it will become just what you're kind of asking, which is a bubble that we've paid for in advance.
Just how long do they expect this demand to last? What is the outlook? Are we looking into 2025, 2026? How far out are we seeing this?
I mean, you look at the Wall Street numbers, and they have this company on a trajectory that is unprecedented, right? They believe that the semiconductor industry will, in very short order, be $1 trillion industry, and the kind of chips that NVIDIA makes will be as much as half, if not more than half, of that total. So that's absolutely enormous, and that says NVIDIA still has a long road to come. But when has the semiconductor industry not overshot, right? We've had so many new things. We've had, obviously, the internet. We've had smartphones. We've had all of these things which have been enormous growth drivers, create a lot of wealth, but we've always overshot. We've always built too much. So can I or anybody else tell you that this time is going to be different? Probably shouldn't be saying that, right?
We're looking at, I'm looking at Jess Menton's story on the Bloomberg terminal. She's got a piece out about the key technical levels that traders are watching here. Apparently, you know, there's a support that sits around $125. $135 is near the top end of their recent range. I guess 113 would be the August retracement. I don't know how much you get into these technicals, Ian, because obviously you spend your time reporting on the fundamentals of this business and of the industry. But how closely do you think people are watching these numbers?
I mean, you just look at the amount of interest, the amount of money that has come into this stock. It's just difficult to quantify how quickly a relatively old company and a company that wasn't an insignificant company has become an absolute superstar. These kind of things just do not happen. And because it's doing something which is relatively esoteric, which is semiconductors after all, there's a lot of difficulty in actually understanding what it is doing and interpreting those trends and translating them into your kind of standard templates for how to judge a company and for how to basically decide when to trade in and when to trade out. So I don't watch those numbers too closely because I'm not so sure that the regular templates mean anything in this particular case.
I just want to comment to our radio listeners, right? Those of you watching on TV can see the price on your screen, but those of you listening on radio may not know NVIDIA hit as high as 147.56 today. So that's around the level that we're looking at, the low around 142.73, but in the sort of $145 range. So it's above all of those levels that I just mentioned. Obviously, it could move quite a bit today. I mean, $300 billion is the market cap number being thrown around in terms of it could move up that much or down that much.
That's a big number. That's a big number. I mean, when we think about this on a broader market scale, Ian, how much do you really think this would potentially move the market? How much of a weight do we really have for NVIDIA earnings in terms of how it will trickle out into the rest of the market performance?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it with those comparisons. It doesn't really exist in a realm of normal comparisons. You told me that a company that's worth more than $3 trillion would move 5%, which it does on a regular basis. That's unprecedented. That kind of level of volatility is an enormous amount of money. And just for context, look at it compared to its nearest two competitors, Intel and AMD. Right? I mean, it can move in one day in terms of market value more than those companies are actually worth. I mean, there's just no comparison and there's no precedent for this, at least amongst semiconductor industry companies.
Yeah, Intel is only worth $100 billion. I mean, that's low rent. And AMD is worth twice that at $220 billion. But NVIDIA is worth more than $3.5 trillion. It is not incredibly unlikely that this is a $4 trillion company.
Right. I mean, and we're going to have to wait and see which way it goes. But I mean, that would really, really change things for the market and see whether or not we can really continue on with this rally that we've witnessed.
All right, Ian, thank you very much. I know you have a very busy afternoon ahead of you, and I hope you can maintain your calm composure there. Ian King from our San Francisco bureau. He will be reporting on NVIDIA earnings when they come out at 4:20. I'm sure there's going to be a T Live on the Bloomberg terminal, so you can type TLIV to follow it. We will obviously be breaking every headline that comes across the Bloomberg terminal here on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio, so stick with us for that as well. NVIDIA coming out after the close today. It rallied yesterday, but is down today about 2.5% in a down market with the S&P 500 off 0.2%. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We are just under 2 hours away from the big event after the close of trading when NVIDIA drops. NVIDIA Wednesday ahead of earnings. NVIDIA right now lower by 2.3%. Yes, complete coverage on Bloomberg television and radio as that number drops. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, will throw in the NASDAQ 100 index and the Russell 2000, all trading in the red. 39-point drop right now on the S&P. 58.77 where we stand. A drop now of 0.7%. The Dow down 116, down 0.3%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 1%. NASDAQ 100 Index also down 1%, with the Russell 2000 now down by 0.7%. The 10-year 4.40%. The 2-year 4.29%. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, up 0.7%. 26.50. West Texas Intermediate crude now trading lower by 0.8%. WTI 68.85 a barrel. Bitcoin climbed to a record for a second consecutive day. MicroStrategy accelerating the pace of its massive purchases of the cryptocurrency. Today, MicroStrategy up by 13.6%. Bitcoin, I mentioned, was trading at a record right now, 93,440, up 1.2%. Bitcoin was above $94,000. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie, thanks very much. Matt Miller here with Nora Melinda in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. We got a number of stories to hit, Nora. I can't wait to hear what Bill Wang has to say in his own defense. He's expected to speak shortly, and the T-Live on this trial has just been riveting.
Bonkers. I'm keeping an eye. I feel like everyone can't stop watching and seeing what's going to happen next.
Will he express remorse? Then we're going to hear about Comcast spinning off CNBC, I guess our chief rival, and MSNBC, as well as some other assets. We'll talk to Chris Palmieri about that. Right now, I want to get to Target. Emily Cohn is here in the studio with us, and I've been talking to her about retail the last couple days. Yesterday, Emily, was an up arrow story with Walmart, really impressing the street, boosting sales, bringing in higher income consumers. Today is the other way around. Target really disappointed, and at least at one point it was down 20%. We'll see what the shares are looking like right now, but what are they doing wrong at Target?
So that's a really good question. What's happening at Target? I think this says a lot about the U.S. consumer, right? Consumers are spending less on non-essential products at Target. Target is a store that you go to for one thing and you pile 20 more things in your cart, and that's what we call discretionary spending, stuff that you don't necessarily need but you want. That's where Target is really hurting right now. Those shoppers are either going to Walmart because they're looking for value, or they're just not spending as much as they did at Target. So that says a lot about the state of the U.S. consumer. They're pickier, they're choosier, they have a strapped budget, and Target is feeling that much more so than Walmart.
Well, how are we thinking about this ahead of the holiday season? Of course, this is an optimal time for a lot of retailers, and I imagine Target is included in that bunch. What are we thinking?
Well, the holiday season is really already underway here, so we're starting to see that a little bit. Also, in this most recent quarter, we had back-to-school shopping, we had Halloween, we had the start of deal days. Black Friday shopping now starts in the summer, so we already had the start of those deal days reflected in this quarter. It's definitely a pressure point for the retailer.
Do you do your holiday shopping at this point already? I don't do it until...
I'm last minute, so I'm not the one to ask, but...
Do you go to Target?
Apparently people are going there. I do go to Target, love Target, and some people call it Target.
Of course, that makes it classier.
You're one of them, right?
Yeah, of course.
But, honestly, people are out there. They're trying to get things sorted and ready for the holiday season, but if it comes down to the two, apparently it seems as though people are going to Walmart.
Well, that point you just made about Target is really interesting. What did Walmart see? They saw the most of their growth coming from higher income households. The Target
people who speak French.
People who speak Target,
right.
Yeah. And that's exactly where Target is feeling the crunch. So we don't have the data yet, but it does seem like the market share at Target is shrinking while it's growing at Walmart. Maybe they're those shoppers that are pulling into a different parking lot.
Well, sales are either stalled or down, depending on your comparison. But inventory built up. Maybe because there wasn't as much of a port strike as they expected. They made what could have been a smart move. In hindsight, it didn't really help much. Does that mean we're going to see discounting at Target? Don't they want to take share back?
That's a really good point. I mean, the CEO, Brian Cornell, said this morning he tried to play down the significance of these negative results and said their stockpiling of goods for the port strike was a one-time problem. So it will be interesting to see how do they move past that, because as we saw in their results, keeping that inventory on hand is very costly.
Yeah, I mean, I see that they're saying that they're planning to lower prices on 2,000 items ahead of the holidays. I wonder how much of that is actually Black Friday and just getting people out there to spend, and how much of it is them playing catch up for overshooting when we think about the port strikes.
Do you know, Emily?
I don't.
No.
Not yet.
Yeah, I mean, they probably do thousands of price reductions before the holiday every year.
It's hard to say which.
Right? They did say that the holiday season is looking good so far, and to your point, Emily, that holiday shopping maybe starts earlier, so they do have maybe a good read on that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it really does just show us about the broader read-through of the consumer. I mean, we got earnings out of TJX, and as I think about a lot of those...
Which were good, right?
I mean, yeah, they weren't terrible, but I mean, I did see the stock was a bit lower earlier, and so I think that when we think about a lot of these companies and seeing whether or not they're actually able to keep up with what consumers are looking for right now, as people are really tightening their wallets, it's something to really keep an eye on, especially as we're thinking about rates being really high and the economy in disarray.
My mind is blown looking at Williams-Sonoma, and the chart is insane. This stock at one point was up 33% today.
Wow.
I mean, that is just unbelievable. At a time when, Emily, we've heard from so many retailers that consumers are choosy, they're price conscious, they're looking for deals. Guess what? You don't find them at Williams-Sonoma.
Well, that's
not cheap.
That's exactly the choice that people are making here, right? And we talk a lot about the bifurcation of spending with consumers.
Right.
Like they're trading up and going to Williams-Sonoma for a splurge that's going to be worth it to them, or they're trading down and going to TJ Maxx, where they know they're going to get a discount on really great brands that they love, and that leaves Target in a really tricky situation.
Most definitely. And I mean, when we think about Williams-Sonoma, funny enough, I had to look it up earlier. Mm-hmm. But ticker WSM, it's a home furnishing store. So
it's basically a kitchen supply store.
Right.
So if you need a whisk.
Yeah. So if we're trying to whip something up in the kitchen, that's what we care about. When it comes to those clothes, the leggings and the athletic wear that you're getting at Target, not so much.
You're not getting it at Target, right? You're getting that probably at Walmart if you're not going to splurge at Williams-Sonoma.
Yeah.
I saw that Walmart was selling more AirPods, more TVs, more tires. These are pricey items.
Yeah, and the kinds of things that Target should be selling too. But
maybe not tires.
Maybe not tires. But yeah, those discretionary products, those are what Target makes a lot of its money off of. But they're losing to people who are pulling into Walmart to do their grocery shopping and then putting those leggings in their basket at Walmart instead.
All right, Emily, great to spend some time with you the last couple of days.
Thank
Hope
you
we get
so
some
much
more
for having
retail
me.
earnings out. We can have you back on the show. I anchor also Bloomberg Open Interest. It's every day from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. with Katie Greifeld and Shonali Bassick, and we have Emily on in the mornings with us. So let's talk, speaking of television, about MSNBC and CNBC and Bravo. I want to bring in Chris Palmieri. He covers Comcast for us out of L.A. And Chris, they're doing a split. I guess they're going to keep Bravo. Who doesn't love, what's it called? What Now with Andy?
They have all the shows. Andy Cohen, are we thinking?
Andy Cohen, exactly. But they're getting rid of CNBC, MSNBC, and what's the other one they're losing? USA. Chris, what's the story here?
Well, I think that one of the big surprises here is, it used to be broadcast TV, NBC, and that were kind of losing viewers, and cable TV was the growth business. And now this is sort of saying the opposite. They're getting out of a lot of these cable channels because they want to focus on streaming and broadcast. They have all of the sports rights, NFL and soon the NBA, and that's also very popular on streaming on their Peacock channel. And we're told the channels being let go or spun off are only about 2% or so of the viewing on Peacock. So this is about that sort of big mass audience that turns out for both the broadcast network and streaming, and that's sort of the play these days.
I mean, is there any sense of the fact that maybe they're a little bit too late to the game? Should they have been doing this a bit earlier here?
Yeah, well, I think probably everybody in the traditional media business feels that way, and it's reflected in the share prices. This is one of the reasons why they're doing this. They're trying to boost Comcast's stock price because they know this is sort of the cable TV business is a drag in terms of investors and Wall Street's appreciation. So they think as a standalone entity, they could make acquisitions of other channels and that, and sort of try to create its own growth path.
I mean, obviously, my biggest concern lies with CNBC. I know a lot of people that work there. Most of them come from here. They are our chief rival in terms of financial news. There are only two places you can really watch it on TV these days. What's going to happen to them if they no longer have, NBC as the generous big brother?
Well, I can tell you there's a lot of angst in the NBC News department about how this impacts them. They share, real estate studio space. People go back and forth in terms of news broadcasts. It's embedded in the name of MSNBC and NBC. Mark Lazarus, who's the Comcast executive, is going to be CEO. Told staff today that maybe it even include a name change for MSNBC. But there will be cooperation agreements as they share things like programming. Even basic things, business services, advertising sales, things like that. So there's a lot to be worked out for sure.
Most definitely. I mean, how long do you think the company has before private equity potentially gets involved? Or do you think they have a bit longer?
Well, they're saying the spinoff itself won't take place for a year. So that would probably happen. And then if somebody else wanted to make an offer, this is company, Comcast is controlled by Brian Roberts, the CEO. He has a big share of the voting stock, and that will be the same case in the spinoff. So ultimately, he'll decide if he wants to part with it.
What are the big growth businesses that Comcast sits on? I know they have an internet access business. They have a wireless phone business. What are the other six pillars of growth that everyone talks about?
6 categories.
Yeah.
The theme parks is a big one. They got a huge new one opening next year in Orlando. Peacock, although it's not making money, the streaming service is considered the future. And they have a few others, business services and that they're investing in, and they think Wall Street will appreciate them more just focusing on those.
What is the biggest part of their business, of those that you listed?
Of the ones that they're keeping, Comcast is really, historically was the biggest cable TV operator. They got passed this year by Charter, but its biggest business is internet, broadband. People getting that contract, connection to their house and streaming that way.
I guess we'll watch What Happens Live, which is what it's called. It's not called What Now.
There you go. There we got it.
Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen. Going to be staying with Comcast. Chris Palmieri going to be staying with us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us out of our studio in LA. We're going to continue to cover this for you and bring you all the latest on Bill Wang's trial as well. He's speaking live in his defense. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading lower. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all declining as investors digest the latest on Ukraine and Russia. Also, they are bracing themselves for NVIDIA earnings after the close of trading. 4:20 when the number drops. Yes, complete coverage on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Ahead of that report, NVIDIA right now lower by 2.1%. This on a down day for the U.S. stock market. S&P down 32, down 0.5%, 58.84. Where we stand now on the S&P, the Dow down 56, a decline there of 0.1%. NASDAQ down 160, a drop of 0.9%. The 10-year yield 4.39% with a 2-year 4.29%. Gold up $20 the ounce, 26.52. That is a gain of about 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%. WTI 68.87 a barrel. Bitcoin now up 1.7%, was trading at a record above 94,000. Right now we're looking at 93,871 on Bitcoin. After earnings, Target shares are plunging 21.4%. Yesterday, recall we heard from Walmart. Walmart shares today higher by 0.3%. Again, NVIDIA after the close of trading down now by 2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thanks very much for that. Matt Miller here with Nora Melinda in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Carol and Tim will be along shortly if you're listening on radio. Of course, the close if you're watching us on television. And we are getting closer and closer to sentencing in the Bill Wang Archegos trial. We'll bring you those headlines as soon as they break. Bill Wang had a moment to speak. He only spoke very shortly. He thanked God and asked the judge for a sentence that will allow him to continue to do good and serve society. He said he feels really terrible about the multi-billion-dollar fraud. Okay, let's get to our next guest in the studio here. Nate Tuff joins us. He is the Chief Investment Officer over at Manulife Investment Management. Nate, great to have you here.
Great to be here.
With us at 731 Lex. I was talking this morning on TV and just now with Nora about a chart Dan Curtis put together, our producer out in London, that shows the put-call open interest ratio dropping while the S&P climbs. And it's been a trend that's in place since shortly before the election. At the end of October, it really is when it started to kick into high gear. Why do you think investors, and this means that investors really aren't hedging as much, even though they should be wanting to hedge more as the price of the S&P gets higher and higher. Why do you think investors are so complacent, so sanguine right now?
Because the markets have done so well. I mean, that's the simple answer. We have seen a lot of complacency for some time, but I would also argue that a lot of people put on hedges in advance of the election, worried about it, right? And so we are seeing some of that naturally roll off as the markets have continued to drive higher post the election as well. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of complacency. Valuations are expensive, but at the same time, earnings coming in pretty darn good, and people are okay with that. And the U.S. is still the place to be. So especially when you look at the S&P 500, there is still a lot of attention, both within the U.S. and globally, to buy U.S. equity.
Yeah, and I know coming into earnings season, it was a low bar, so it has given companies a lot of room to beat that expectation. But and also in the mind of investors is the Fed. Mm-hmm. So we had that jumbo rate cut, 50 basis point cut in September. We had the quarter point cut recently this past month. How are you thinking about the cadence of cuts moving forward as we look into 2025?
Our belief and our baseline view is that the Fed needs to continue the path. Rather than get distracted by potential policy that's still very uncertain to what the specifics are, the Fed should continue on this path of bringing rates down, assuming that inflation continues, even though it's kind of stalled here a bit, continues that general path over the trend, as well as the overall marketplace from a jobs perspective continues to hold up pretty well. We think the Fed should do another quarter point in December and continue that trend until new information requires them to either pivot, or if we do get the recession, which some people are still calling for, that they then need to cut more aggressively. But the base case right now is quarter points for the next several meetings.
I haven't heard anyone call for a recession in a hell of a long time. I've heard the economy.
It worries me a little bit that there's not, right?
Yeah, no, we're not talking about it anymore.
There are no bears, right?
There aren't. It doesn't feel that way, at least.
I agree. And going back to the first comment about complacency, it's very real across professional investors as well as retail investors. Now, do I think it's to the point where the markets are over exuberant? No, I don't. But I do think there is a lot of people who are quite happy with how things are going, and we're arguably dismissing some of the red flags that are out there. And there are signs that there's risk, and there are risks with policy as well. And so next year, our view is while the equity markets can continue to run in the near term, I do have worries that we're not likely to see another big equity return next year, and we are likely to see more volatility. So I think people are underappreciating the risk in the markets.
Yeah, I mean, we just have targets raised one after the other, right? Yep. 6,600, I think, is what Mike Wilson of 6,500 recently said. And he's supposed to be a bear, right? But there will be, or there could be a time when someone, next year says, man, I wish I'd listened to Nate Tuft last year and hedged my portfolio a little bit. How do you suggest setting up your portfolio for safety?
So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to think of ways to bring more ballast into the portfolio. And we actually are still technically overweight equities on the margin. We're much less overweight than we were 6 months ago. But the things we're doing is upgrading our fixed income to be more investment grade and reducing our high yield exposure. We're adding things like gold, which we've been a fan of for a year and are still a fan of. We're making sure we have other diversifiers in the private market space as well as broad commodity space in our portfolios. And within the equity area, we're not saying you should be underweight technology, but we do think you should recycle some of the wins that most people are sitting on and putting it into areas like financials and healthcare, where there's a potential for a bit more ballast if things were to get a bit frothy and see some downside. So we're thinking of it from a multifaceted perspective, building a more diversified portfolio with enough ballast in there to protect if we get into a more volatile environment.
Is now the time for small caps, Nate?
I do think small caps have an opportunity here. Typically, people think about small caps as an underperformer when equities do poorly. I actually think that's not likely the case this time. There's such a valuation cushion built into small caps, they actually might outperform large cap growth companies when we get that next volatile spurt. And so I actually think there is a setup here where there's a broadening of market breadth, and that some of these areas that haven't participated might surprise people in an environment where we get more volatility.
I mean, I guess, what's your definition of small caps, right? Because now when the big stocks are $3 trillion worth, I mean, everything looks small compared to that.
And I do think you have to be careful in the small cap space, too. There's a lot of small caps that just aren't worthy of an investor's dollar.
40%, I think, of the Russell 2000 is unprofitable.
But at the same time, there are some good quality small caps, and there are a lot of mid caps that I would qualify in the same category, because the mid caps are also cheap relative to large caps. And so there is a universe of small to mid cap names that have higher quality that are priced relative to history, 20-year history, basically at lows, really good valuations with much better earnings expectations, at least comparable earnings expectations to large caps. Over the last several years, that has not been the case. Now, there's always a risk you don't get the earnings to actually come through, but the expectations now for those big names versus the small names are much closer than they have been over the last several years.
Well, just a couple weeks ago, of course, uncertainty was abounding as we were thinking about the presidential election. So when you're thinking about what you've been having conversations with your clients, how have your conversations changed post us getting the results?
Well, every client's a little bit different, and everyone sits on a different side of the political spectrum as well. But I think, generally speaking, complacency is still there. People are generally still putting money to work. People are still afraid of the fixed income markets because they're worried about adding duration when they see this recent rise in interest rates. So I think there's some real opportunities, particularly in the belly of the curve, that people are underappreciating given the yields you can get and the potential that yields could come down. I also think at the same time, people are really focused on what is to come when it comes to policy and how impactful will that be. And no one really knows the answer. The hope right now by the market is that any of the more negative policy would be offset by positive policy and facts. So the market net still gets a benefit. I think that's a big question. We just don't know the answer, but that makes me wonder why there is so much complacency, because there is too many people sitting out there hoping that the policies will net out to be neutral or favorable.
Yeah, there's still much more uncertainty than I think we expected post-election or
Definitely.
we had thought about. Nate, great to get some time with you. Thanks so much for joining us. Nate Tuff there, Chief Investment Officer at Manulife Investment Management, here with us in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. We continue to wait on the verdict in the Bill Hwang case, and we are going to give you the details as soon as they cross the wire. Of course, he spoke, but only shortly, and said he feels really terrible about the Archegos losses. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stennebeck on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
Matt Miller here with Nora Melinda in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. We have been waiting on tenterhooks, really, for the verdict in the Bill Hwang Archegos trial. We are expecting to get it moments from now. We just heard Bill Hwang's short statement in the courtroom in his defense, saying he feels really terrible about the losses, but he asks that the judge give him a sentence that will allow him to continue to do good and serve society. Our Sally Bakewell standing by with some reporting on this. Sally, the judge doesn't seem to think Bill Hwang was doing a heck of a lot of good, does he?
That is right. I mean, there has been a lot of back and forth in the courtroom this afternoon about, the severity of the verdict that Bill Hwang should get. The prosecutors have recommended that he spent more than 21 years behind bars, arguing that this massive fraud at Archegos follows a pattern of law breaking at his previous firm. But his lawyers wanted no prison time at all and sort of sought to really build a picture of him today, almost like an appeal, even though he's already been found guilty, of this hard-working teen who, you know, a God-fearing adult and sort of seeking leniency for him. The judge said in the court this afternoon that the position of no jail time was utterly ridiculous. And the defense then tried to sort of argue that the money lost was mainly Huang's himself, that he didn't spend much money on himself, and said, you know, a sentence of sort of 4 to 5 years might be more appropriate.
So what's the most severe of sentences he could be facing?
So prosecutors have recommended that he spend more than 21 years behind bars, which obviously would be, you know, extremely significant. But the things that they've been trying to iron out this afternoon ahead of the sentencing are things like the loss experienced by the victims, which is a little more complicated because the victims were actually banks, and it's slightly harder to feel a lot more sympathy for these sophisticated companies who knew exactly what they were doing, or that's what the argument of the defense lawyer is, that they knew exactly what they were doing when they were engaging with Huang.
Although the judge said, if you cheat a fool, you're still cheating. I mean, the judge has really made some priceless comments throughout this trial, but today alone, musing about why good people do bad things. He says a God-fearing man who cheats fellow men. It's been an unusual case in terms of the judge's commentary and involvement, hasn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has. And I think, you know, you brought up the element of faith in this case. That has been used a lot by the defense. And we also heard from Huang himself. You know, he said that he is grateful to God for so many blessings that he's had in his life. He said he felt deep pain for all of Archegos' employees and the banks and all of those who have suffered, and that he, as you mentioned, feels really terrible for what happened. And the lawyers arguing for him have used his faith and charitable giving, particularly through his Grace and Mercy Foundation, to say that this justifies a lenient sentence. So it is an unusual case in the factors that the judge has to weigh up. It's not your normal sort of white-collar sentencing, which often involve these very complicated calculations of losses that can require these lengthy, detailed arguments. And that is also why perhaps we haven't yet heard the sentencing, because it does take a little more time.
Well, he doesn't seem very remorseful at all, does he, Bill Huang? He says he feels a deep pain for all of Archegos' employees, the banks and all the employees at the banks who suffered, but there's really a societal loss when banks take billion-dollar hits like this that he doesn't seem to recognize.
Yes, and his lack thereof remorse has also come up in the case today. And again, I think the defense lawyer has tried to detract from that and deflect from that, again, by sort of painting this picture of, you know, a man who sort of came to the US with a family with less than $3,000 in their pocket, and he's worked hard to build himself up to where he is. And that maybe he doesn't need to, you know, express so much remorse because the money that was lost was largely his money.
I mean, is there anything swinging in his favor here, Sally? What's the strategy? Quickly, in about a minute or less.
I really think that it's going to be a tough one. As you mentioned, the judge brought up Sam Bankman-Fried himself, who got 25 years for the FTX saga. The judge has already said that, you know, they can't really use this sort of blame the victim defense, because Huang's lawyers had argued that the banks were sophisticated players who understood the risks of trading with Archegos, you know, they had a profit motive, that they sort of bypassed the risks in order to earn lucrative fees. But the judge has already said, you know, he's barred the sort of blame the victim defense, which might be a big issue here.
Once worth $30 billion. Bill Huang says he only has $55 million left. Nora, how would you survive if you only had $55 million?
I think I'd be doing pretty well.
It's difficult. Sally Bakewell, thanks so much for joining us. Sally is Bloomberg News America's finance team leader, talking to us about the Bill Huang trial. We're still waiting sentencing, and we'll bring it to you the moment it comes across the wire. Waiting, of course, as well for NVIDIA earnings at 4:20. You definitely want to stay tuned for that. And Carol and Tim are going to come back any moment now, joining us from the Schwab Impact Conference in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.
is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by O'Reilly Auto Parts.
I'm Cammie McCormick. A judge in Georgia has sentenced a Venezuelan migrant to life in prison without the possibility of parole for killing nursing student Laken Riley.
There's very little, including the sentence of Mr. Ibarra, that's going to help much. And I acknowledge that.
Jose Ibarra's case became part of the immigration debate during the presidential election. He entered the U.S. illegally. Susan Smith, who murdered her 2 young boys 30 years ago by rolling her car into a South Carolina lake with them inside, was denied parole today.
Susan Smith is denied parole. The vote is unanimous.
Smith made a tearful plea for her release.
I'm sorry. I don't know. I know that's not enough. I know it's not, but I don't know. I know those just sound like words, but they come from my heart. They really do.
She claimed at the time she had been carjacked. Donald Trump's choice to be Attorney General has been on Capitol Hill today, meeting with lawmakers, some of whom may be skeptical about his chances because of the House ethics investigation. Correspondent Scott McFarland.
Pivotal day for Matt Gaetz' future, an inflection point, not just because he's taking these meetings amid concern from both parties about what is in that House ethics investigation of Gaetz, but the House Ethics Committee that produced that report is meeting and potentially having a vote to decide whether to release that report publicly.
At least 2 deaths are being blamed on the powerful storm pounding the Pacific Northwest. Washington state has been hard hit. More than 500,000 people are without power. Meteorologist Grant Gilmore.
We'll see very heavy rainfall. In fact, some places could pick up 10 to 15 inches of rain. In Northern California, we might even see 20 inches of rain. And this is just over the matter of a couple of days.
Thousands of healthcare workers are walking off the job at University of California hospitals. Matt Bigler has that story.
So we are striking against the University of California's unfair labor practices.
Pharmacist Matias Campos says they've been negotiating with the UC system for months and are now working without a contract. The main sticking points, better pay and chronic understaffing.
We're overworked, we're understaffed, and patients want to get care here. So the volume of patients that we're seeing is increasing.
The 2-day strike affects all 10 UC campuses and 5 medical centers. UC officials say they're working to mitigate potential impacts on patient care. Matt Bigler for CBS News, San Francisco.
The U.S. Embassy in Kiev will reopen tomorrow, a day after it was closed due to the threat of an attack in the Ukrainian capital. This is CBS News. A familiar face is all banged up again, this time after a nasty fall. Here's CBS News correspondent Steve Kathan.
74-year-old Jay Leno says he was hurt after falling 60 feet down a hill while taking a shortcut on foot to a restaurant outside Pittsburgh.
I broke my wrist, lost the nail on the finger. I'm all black and blue.
3 hours after the tumble, the banged-up Leno with an eye patch and bruised face was able to perform at a club. In recent years, the former Tonight Show host was seriously burned in a fire at his home garage and broke bones in a motorcycle accident. Steve Kathan, CBS News.
Astronauts are exposed to a lot in space. Now, new studies show conditions in space can impact cognitive performance like memory and attention. It does not appear to have a lasting impact. Scientists say it seems to right itself when astronauts return to Earth. I'm Cammie McCormick, CBS News.
This This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. We are live on the West Coast. It's 12 noon here in San Francisco. I'm turning over the time. It's lunchtime, isn't it?
Yeah.
3 p.m. back in New York.
Also lunchtime, if you want a late lunch.
Always lunchtime for Tim. We've got 60 minutes until the closing bell. Folks, we are at Schwab Impact in San Francisco, the Moscone Center. We are surrounded by the registered investment advisory community. That's what Schwab is all about. And so we're going to be talking to some voices at Schwab specifically about what's going on post-election, the moods, the trends, what investment advisors are doing, kind of getting the lowdown on the investment environment on a really important day where NVIDIA is likely to set the tone going forward.
4,500 attendees here. This is the conference for independent RIAs and independent record keepers of Charles Schwab. It is the largest and longest running gathering of RIAs in the country. We've got advisors from all over the U.S. and those in the industry who support them with services and tools. As Carol mentioned, we're going to hear from quite a few of them over the next couple of days. And of course, spend a good portion of our program talking about NVIDIA.
Got to do it. But we're going to find out where people are putting money to work. Having said that, just sitting down, we're going to talk to him in just a moment. Omar Aguilar, he's the CIO, CEO of Schwab Asset Management. So we're going to get into what he is seeing post-election, but also some of those key behavioral biases to watch out for. I think that's an interesting aspect of what to do in the market.
Also, ETFs, so hot right now.
Yep.
We are going to talk ETFs with the company's head of
one.
innovation and stewardship. What's that?
Schwab just launched a new one.
They're always launching new ones.
They are.
Yeah.
All right, folks. And as Tim said, we're all in on NVIDIA. But let's get a check on the trade because it's kind of a wait-and-see approach. Let's head back to New York and to Charlie Pellet.
All right, I thank you very much. And we will likely see a big impact from NVIDIA after the close of trading. Right now, NVIDIA shares ahead of earnings coming up at 4:20 New York time. NVIDIA right now lower by 1.7%. All part of a broader tech sell-off with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all trading lower. S&P right now down 29, down 0.5%. We got the S&P at 58.87. Dow Industrials down 42 now, down 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 143, down 0.7%. Russell 2000 Index down 0.4%, with a 10-year 4.41%, the 2-year 4.31%. Gold up $19 the ounce, up 0.7%, 26.50 right now. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.8%, 68.87 a barrel. Bitcoin back above 94,000, trading at a record 94,225 right now on Bitcoin, up by 2.1%. NVIDIA after the close. Tracy McMillian is head of global asset allocation strategy at Wells Fargo Bank, and she says this report could have a big impact on sentiment.
They're a bellwether for AI spending, so we will see if the torrid pace of AI spending has held up. If they have another blowout quarter, we think that probably gives investors the green light to continue holding their Mag 7 stocks. So that will indicate status quo. If they fall short, then we could see that roil broader markets, we think.
Bill Huang, 18 years in prison. Archegos founder Bill Huang ordered to spend 18 years in prison for fraud and market manipulation tied to the stunning 2021 collapse of his $36 billion family office, capping a case that riveted Wall Street. The 60-year-old Huang was sentenced today by U.S. District Judge Alvin Hellerstein in New York. A federal jury convicted him in July after a 2-month trial. So again, the sentence, 18 years in prison. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. As he said, a 2-month trial. That's the 2021 collapse of Bill Huang's family office. It was a $36 billion family office, though the collapse of it, we should point out, contributed to some significant losses throughout the financial industry. You're talking about helping bring about the demise of Credit Suisse, losses at Morgan Stanley, also at UBS, Nomura, other major banks. So it could have been a 25-year sentence. People were liking it, akin to what happened to Samuel Bankman-Fried. But again, we did get the headline. Charlie's talking about it. An 18-year sentence in prison. Bill Huang, I'm looking at our live blog, not flinching at the sentence, while some supporters in the courtroom dropped their heads.
Yeah, ahead of that sentencing, Wong telling the judge that he feels, quote, really terrible about Archegos' losses. Prosecutors did argue for a 21-year prison term, so 18 years, pretty close to that. The judge did call Wong's request for no jail time, though, quote, utterly ridiculous. We're going to have much more on this coming up a little later in the program. In the meantime, let's get back to here in San Francisco, Carol.
Yeah, let's get to it.
Schwab.
We're at Schwab Impact here in the Moscone Center. Just want to point out that UBS recently came out with a report. It found that millionaires already accounted for about 1.5% of the adult population. They analyzed this in 2023, and they said by 2028, that will have risen in 52 of the 56 markets that it surveyed. In some markets, the number of U.S. dollar millionaires will increase by as much as 50% over the next 5 years. Wealth management has been a booming business for the last few years, I would say, and it continues to be so.
Yeah, it's all kept those involved in the industry super busy. Client assets at the retail brokerage Charles Schwab and the wealth arms of these 6 largest U.S. banks surged $5 trillion in the 12 months through September. 23% jump as the group's revenue from the business collectively topped $84 billion so far this year.
Let's get to it with a guest. He knows what's going on. We're delighted to be here in San Francisco with Omar Aguilar. He's the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Investment Officer at Schwab Asset Management. Omar, nice to have you here with us. You see a lot. Tell us about what you guys are seeing in terms of wealth management.
Yes, and welcome to Impact.
Thank you for having us.
It's great to see you, everybody, here in San Francisco. We see a continuous need and continuous demand of clients for advice. I think as people continue to grow in their lives and they continue to accumulate wealth, the need for them to have somebody they can rely on and continue to just work on what do I do with their money? How do they actually set up? And, it's kind of interesting with all the information that is available today, there's not a lot of people that actually can make a decision on what to do with their money.
Seriously?
And it's just difficult to do.
Why? What is it that they're lacking? What kind of information are they seeking?
I think it's almost like when you go grocery shopping. There is a lot of options. Back when I started my career, you wanted to save for retirement, there was one option, just buy a target date fund. That's it. Based on what year you're going to plan to retire, that's one option. But now, today, there's multiple options, multiple things. You can do managed accounts. You could do it on your own. You could do a model. There's several things that you can do. And therefore, there's a natural human, bias that tells you, oh, well, if there's too many options, I'm overly done. I cannot make a decision. It's almost like me trying to find a shampoo. It's like, no way you can actually pick something that will be good, and then once you pick it, there is a regret. It's like, well, did I pick the right one? Did I not pick the right one? Maybe it wasn't or the price. And that's a big part of the same thing happens when it comes down to finances and when it comes that. That's why there's what we call a bull market for advice. Especially when you accumulate wealth, there is a significant amount of need for clients to reach a financial advisor or an RIA to be able to just find what is the right solution for them.
What's interesting, though, is Charles Schwab offers both of these sort of different areas. You could do it all yourself using Charles Schwab's retail brokerage platform, or you could use an RIA whose back end is supported by Charles Schwab. How do you support both of those things, even though they offer very different things?
Yes, well, that's a big part of, the institutional knowledge of trying to do things through client eyes. And in many cases, there's many clients that, want to use their tools on their own. And in many cases, they actually know what they want to do, and they're looking exactly what it is. And again, just thinking about, like a supermarket, there's people that know exactly the brand they want, exactly how they want to do it, and they're loyal to what their pieces are, and they will continue to do that. There are others that are feeling more comfortable, relying on an advisor for them to find what their path is. And, both of them are reliable. Both of them are actually things that they have. There's some clients that like to trade every day. There are other clients that want to buy it today and forget about it. So there's a lot of flavors for everybody.
Omar, in the wealth management business, I'm just curious how many people are find it, park it, leave it there. They're thinking longer term. And as a result, we're going to have a great bunch of the Schwab team tomorrow on. Liz Ann Saunders, we're going to talk equities, global equities with Jeff Kleintop. We're going to talk fixed income with Kathy Jones. But increasingly, we see people wanting access to the private markets, private credit, alt assets. How much of that is at play with you guys, too?
Well, it is a big part of the market. And I think to the first part of your question, there's a lot of clients that like to have what we call a financial plan, that would like to have an asset allocation, that would like to have a long-term setup. And, the majority of clients and our philosophy encourages for everybody to have a financial financial plan. Everybody should have a financial plan. And then once you have a financial plan, you can set up your long-term investment objectives on what you're investing for. And in many cases, it could be retirement, it could be income, it could be, growing, it could be buying a house, it could be a lot of things that you can do and then put the money to work that way. Now, that being said, the human part of every investor and every client basically shows that when you hear the word cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, you hear the words AI, you hear that, immediately you pick up the phone and say, how can I be part of it?
Do your clients do that?
Of course, they do that all the time. And they do it all the time in any situations where they have, and then, how much exposure I have to the Max 7. Do I need to get out of the Max 7? Do I need to hedge my... So the normal setup of a human behavior to try to act on recent information is something that happens all the time.
What's the pressure that your clients are feeling when it comes to fees? And when I say your clients, I mean the RIAs and the wealth managers who are out there offering their services for a percentage of the assets that they're managing on your behalf. Because there are a lot of robo-advisors out there, including a robo-advisor from Charles Schwab.
Yes. Well, what we have done, we have run these studies over time that basically show what clients are looking for. Number one, yes, they're incredibly price sensitive. Price and cost is a big part of the driver for decision making. Transparency is a big part. Going back to the other question you had about private markets, that's a little bit of the hesitation today for clients to try to get more access to it. They're interested. They actually like to have it.
But they're cautious a little bit?
But they're cautious about it because of the transparency and the liquidity. And in many cases, once you explain that there is less transparency and there's less liquidity for a private markets, then they step back and say, oh, let me think about it. I mean, initially sounds great, and initially sounds like a great opportunity, and in fact, we encourage, a portion of their investments to be in private markets. However, once you explain the trade-offs, then it starts to just, make a big difference decision.
I kind of love to hear that because I feel like we've spent so much time at various investment conferences and everybody just wants to talk about private equity and in particular private credit. But a lot of folks are saying, you got to understand that you lock your money up, you can't get access, and the transparency issues are maybe not there. So it sounds to me that your investors are savvy enough to be asking these questions.
Yeah, no, and not only that, but the big part is the investors like to see, especially younger investors, they like to see data. They like to see information, before they make a decision. And this is a very interesting.
Are you looking at Tim as younger investors?
Yes,
Are you not looking at me? I'm just
looking at both of you. But when I actually think about it, when we do studies by generation, like silent generation baby boomers, they tend to be a little more trusting in that sense. And in other words, like they trust the advisor, they have a relationship with the advisor, and they don't necessarily need to have that much evidence. And this happens actually with my kids. Even when I recommend a restaurant, they still have to Yelp it and try to figure out what the stars are. And in many cases like that, why do you recommend that it only had 3 stars? So it is one of these that they suggest evidence. They need evidence to make a decision. And in those cases, when you compare performance on private markets and public markets,
right,
you immediately start saying, why would I lock my own money in where I can actually be there? Now, that's not the whole story, but I think that's a little bit of the hesitation.
We teased that we were going to ask you about key behavioral biases to be on the lookout for in today's environment. What are they?
Say that again?
The key behavioral biases that are out there in today's investment environment.
Well, I would say there's 3 that are incredibly, prevalent in today's market. Number 1 is herding behavior. Herding behavior, which is exactly what we're just talking about. And the Max 7 was clearly a big part. AI, Max 7, Bitcoin.
NVIDIA?
Definitely, part of, what's going to happen. A lot of people will be watching this afternoon, or actually in a few hours, just on that report. But that component about that, and in fact, for that particular thing, not a lot of clients knew what NVIDIA was 5 years ago. It's not until now that it became so popular, and that's a big part of what is called the FOMO, and that's one of the biases. The second bias is called recency bias, which is people tend to just, look at the most recent information and extrapolate into the future. Oh, the market has been up for 3 months. It should be going up forever. And that's the kind of behavior that people tend to have. Or the same thing goes back, to when things go wrong. It's like immediately they become like, well, if we have had two bad deals, it's time for get out, and then try to just panic that way. And those are 2 of the typical, behavioral biases that are very typical today.
Carol mentioned crypto, so I got to ask about Bitcoin because it did reach a new record today.
Tim does a whole show that's just about crypto. Everybody's doing a show that's just about crypto.
Tuesdays noon Wall Street time. Feel free to tune in. But it's interesting because it's the whole market of Bitcoin, the whole market cap of Bitcoin, not even the market cap of NVIDIA. So I think a lot of people would say there's still a lot of room for people who are crypto curious at this point. What portion of an investor's portfolio, if any, should be allocated to crypto?
Well, we have had points of view on crypto in general to basically say, like, look, any client could actually use, trades as a way to just generate or try to find any solutions they have. For a strategic long-term asset allocation, we haven't adopted crypto as being part of like what you would use for the long run. And in many cases, the reason why is because for our strategic asset allocation work, we normally try to find what are the fundamentals that allow that to be valued and what are the economic factors that drive the performance of certain asset classes. You compare NVIDIA to crypto. Well, in the case of NVIDIA, there is earnings, there is clearly financial situations, there are results, there is everything else. In the case of crypto,
there's actually regulatory SEC filings, right?
There is, exactly. They are accountable
and
for
cash flows.
And cash flows.
Cash flows.
Lots of cash flows.
And actually, there is a product out there that you can touch.
Right.
In the case of crypto, a lot of these prices tend to be driven by supply and demand. It's supply and demand driven. It basically people have asked me the question and said, like, well, but isn't gold the same? Like, gold is also supply and demand driven? Yes, it is. But the difference is that there is a bar that you can touch.
Omar, 20 seconds. Top question you think on everybody's mind are registered investment advisors right now in this environment? Number one question, investment question.
The number one question is, what would we think about the market, next year, given, potential less regulation, potential, tariffs, and potential changes in the way that, the SEC, will move down their agenda next year.
All right, good stuff. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you guys.
Great setup for us here on this Wednesday. Omar Aguilar, he is the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Investment Officer of Schwab Asset Management, joining us here at Schwab Impact in San Francisco.
Hey, let's get back to some breaking news. Bill Wong, formerly of Archegos, getting 18-year sentence for the collapse of that firm. Prosecutors argued for a 21-year prison term. A judge called Wong's request for no jail time, quote, utterly ridiculous. Let's go right now to Bloomberg News legal reporter Chris Dolmetsch, who joins us from U.S. Southern District Courthouse in New York City. Chris, we got the headlines just now. Give us a view inside the courtroom or wherever you are to get an understanding of just what you're seeing from Bill Wong as we speak.
Yeah, so they're still upstairs in the courtroom discussing the victim losses and whether there'll be any restitution. So that could take a little while. But Bill kind of looked stoic when the sentence was pronounced. A lot of his supporters hung their heads, but he remained kind of calm and straightforward as he did throughout the entire trial. Obviously, there's a lot of appeal issues here. He's asked for bail pending appeal, so it's not clear, how long it will take, when he would go to prison. That's being determined right now also.
So, we were hearing, Chris, that it could have been as much as 25 years. How do we read this sentence? It's obviously still a pretty significant one. I'm just curious, what's the read on what it could have been and what it actually is?
Yeah, so the prosecutors had asked for 21 years, which is a very significant sentence, obviously, especially for somebody who's 60 years old. The defense had asked for no jail time, which was a little surprising given the size of the losses here and the fact that he was convicted on most of the counts. The judge called that ridiculous, in a word, and took his lawyer to task for that. In the end, she kind of said, well, we would think like a 46-month to 57-month sentence, which is in line with some of the sentencing guidelines, would be more appropriate. The judge clearly did not think that was the case. He said, the size of the losses here, despite this man's life of good works and charitable contributions, just make it too impossible for him to pronounce a lesser sentence.
Chris, there was an idea with the sentencing of Sam Bankman-Fried that prosecutors wanted to send a message to the financial industry, but more so the crypto industry. Do you see that in the sentencing of Bill Wong here as well?
Yeah, that's a major factor in sentencing on white-collar crimes, is the need to provide deterrence, general deterrence to other people who might do similar frauds. And that really is the biggest consideration here, I think, along with the size of the losses, given that Bill's, the judge admitted, they're not really worried that Bill Wong is going to go out and commit more crimes. So, like, sending a message is really the most important thing for the prosecutors here, to the markets, and to really to make people feel confident that they can invest. You know, while this was a family office and really wasn't investing public money, the banks that, you know, he was working with are big banks. You know, it led to the demise of Credit Suisse, which the judge pointed out. So in the end, you know, this is a big fraud, and the need to send some sort of message is paramount.
Yeah.
So, Chris, that's exactly where I wanted to end. You mentioned Credit Suisse. Wong was convicted in fraud in July over the collapse of Archegos. For somebody listening right now who might say, wait a second, who were the victims here? How would you answer that question?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the answer is that the banks, the counterparties that work with them, are the victims. But there's also a smaller set of victims, and that's Archegos' employees, many of whom had deferred compensation. When I just left the court before, that was exactly what they were addressing, more than $11 billion in deferred compensation that employees said that they lost because of that. And Wong is facing a lawsuit from one of those people over that deferred comp. So, you know, while the banks were the victims here, and ostensibly, you know, they lost money due to this conduct, there are other people who are ancillary victims as well.
Yeah, when you run a $36 billion family office, right, there's a fair amount of moving parts internally and externally, and certainly the impact was felt. It was certainly a story that has been, you know, riveted Wall Street, and we just kind of watched it in awe. Someone who was not necessarily a household name, but certainly a significant collapse, no doubt about it. Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate the update there and the reporting. Bloomberg News legal reporter Chris Dolmetsch, he is out there, the U.S. Southern District Courthouse in downtown New York City. All right, folks, we are live at Schwab Impact in San Francisco. We've got a great guest coming up in just a moment. But first up, we want to send it back to Bloomberg headquarters in New York City, get another update on today's trading, because keep in mind, we've got NVIDIA earnings coming in the close about a half hour away.
Indeed, and right now we have seen a turnaround since our last update for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, up 23 points now, higher by less than 0.1%. The S&P does remain lower, down 21 now, drop there of 0.4%. NASDAQ down 113, drop there of 0.6%. Stocks are stumbling as investors brace for NVIDIA after the bell. They're also weighing the latest Ukraine-Russia tensions. 10-year, 4.41%. The 2-year, 4.31%. Gold up $16 the ounce, up 0.6%. Crude 68.87 a barrel, down